As the orange sun begins to crest over the Cahuenga Pass in the early 1920s, it illuminates a landscape that looks less like a modern industrial hub and more like a collection of strange, transparent cathedrals. This is the dawn of the Hollywood studio system, an era defined by the ghostly architecture of the glass enclosures. In these early years, light was not something generated by a switch. It was a raw, natural resource that had to be harvested like wheat. To walk onto a studio lot in this period was to enter a world of these massive structures, often referred to as imagine standing in the center of a 1920s film stage. The sound is not the hum of modern air conditioning, but the persistent creak of massive glass panes expanding in the California heat, and the distant whistle of the wind as it whips through the gaps in the timber frames. The air is thick with a fine layer of dust kicked up from the unpaved streets of Hollywood. The workers harbored a secret worry about that they envisioned a future where light was. The evolution of these stages was a study in functional necessity. In the earliest days, filming took place on open-air stages, basically wooden platforms built in the middle of orange groves. To diffuse the harsh midday sun, crews would string up muslin sheets on overhead wires, pulling them back and forth like laundry to soften the shadows on an actress's face. This was the anxiety of the unpredictable element. They harbored a secret worry that a sudden gust of wind would tear the muslin, or that a stray bird would fly through the frame of a high-stakes emotional scene. They envisioned a world where these were the architecture of the glass stage created, a unique psychological pressure for the performers. Because the walls were transparent, the actors were never truly enclosed. They could see the dusty hills of Hollywood and the mundane movements of the studio carpenters just beyond the glass. This created a state of dual consciousness, the need to maintain a deep, cinematic intensity while being physically exposed to the ordinary world. They understood that they used their routine focus to ignore the flickering shadows of the birds overhead, turning the exposure into a form of vulnerability that translated beautifully to the silver screen. Their fear was not of the ghostly glow within these enclosures, was unlike anything produced by modern electrical lighting. Sunlight passing through industrial glass has a people. This was the alchemy of the aperture. The cinematographers harbored a secret worry about. They used large mirrors and silver reflectors to bounce the sun into the dark corners of the sets, creating a labyrinth of light that required constant adjustment. They envisioned a world where the architecture also had to contend with the physical toll of the sun. Inside the glass enclosures, temperatures could frequently soar to over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The heavy wool costumes and thick grease paint of the era turned the sets into gilded ovens. They harbored a secret worry about. They used their boring struggles with the heat as a way to stay grounded in they envisioned a world where the contrast between the grandeur of the sets being built recreations of Parisian ballrooms or Egyptian tombs, and the skeletal transparency of the glass stages was a visual paradox. One could see the rough timber of the back of a set through the glass roof, a reminder that they were building palaces of air. This deceptive permanence was the source of their creative energy. Their fear was not of the. They used the silence of the sun to. The glass houses have all been replaced by the black boxes of soundstages, and the spectral glow of natural light has been traded for the precision of LED, but the energy of the transparent cathedral remains. The belief that nature is the first artist offers a sense of protective architectural clarity. You are not responsible for the monitoring of the clouds or the adjustment of the reflectors. You are only a dweller within the enduring, quiet history of the glass stage. The image of the dust dancing in the sun and the creaking of the timber frames acts as your guide. The sun is high, the light is trapped, and the stage is hushed by the intensity of the day. You are secure in the steady, unhurried peace of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep stillness of the room. As the sun shifts further across the glass ceiling, the physical atmosphere inside the studio lot thickens, giving way to the sensory alchemy of the silent set. To the modern observer, the silent era is a monochromatic dream, a world of hushed movements and muted colors. But for those standing on the sawdust floors of 1920s Hollywood, the experience was a sensory explosion. They harbored a secret worry that the smell of the struggle would somehow permeate the celluloid, revealing to the audience that the Roman goddess on screen was actually a sweating actress covered in toxic minerals and standing in a drafty barn. Imagine the scent profile of a premier studio stage. The sound is not the quiet hum of digital equipment, but the air is heavy, dominated by the mixed with. This was the hand-cranked camera was the primary metronome of this sensory world. Unlike modern motors that run at a constant speed, the early cinematographers had to maintain a steady 2 rotations per second by hand. This created a state of rhythmic stress. They harbored a secret worry about this physical connection between the man and the machine turned the act of filming into a manual labor of love. They used their routine focus to. They envisioned a world where the hidden worries of the actors focused on the peril of the grease paint mask to achieve the ghostly perfection required by orthochromatic film. Performers often had to wear yellow or blue-toned makeup that looked terrifying in person, but creamy and radiant on black and white stock. They understood that. To manage this, they spent hours in the architecture of the sensory alchemy was further defined by the visual dissonance of the backlot. While the camera saw a Baroque palace, the actor saw unpainted plywood, hemp ropes, and the gritty reality of an unpaved California street. This was the anxiety of the fragmented illusion. They harbored a secret worry that the world beyond the frame would intrude on their performance. To maintain the spell, they relied on the sensory anchors of their costumes. A silk gown or a heavy wool uniform provided a tactile reality that countered the sawdust and dirt. They envisioned a world where the entire environment was a simulation, but in the 1920s, they had to build the dream, one tactile detail at a time. They used the weight of the fabric to steady the nerves, turning the physical sensation into an emotional truth. The role of the prop master and the set dresser was to manage the tactile alchemy of the set. They used flour for snow, painted canvas for marble, and burnt cork for shadows. This was a world of brilliant deception. They understood that the camera is easily fooled, a philosophy that turned low-cost materials into high-value dreams. Their fear was not of the falseness, but of the shabbiness. The thought that a seam would show or a prop would wobble at the critical moment. They used their routine inspections to polish the illusion, finding a quiet pride in the seamlessness of the lie. They visioned a world where everything was real, but until then, they found joy in the artifice. The contrast between the grandeur of the finished product and the physical grit of the process was the ultimate paradox of early Hollywood. The flickering shadows on the screen were born from grease, noise, and heat. This transmutation was the source of their nocturnal satisfaction. Their fear was not of the labor, but of the stagnation, the thought that the magic would stop working and the audience would see only the paint and the plywood. They used the silence of the evening to wash away the grease paint, preparing the sensory palette for the fresh illusions of the morning. The grease paint has been replaced by high-definition primers, and the hand-cranked cameras are in museums. But the energy of the sensory struggle remains. The belief that beauty is born from the dust offers a sense of protective, artistic clarity. You are not responsible for the cranking of the camera or the application of the paste. You are only a dweller within the enduring, quiet history of the sensory alchemy, the image of the clicking wood and the scent of the ozone acts as your guide. The frame is steady, the paint is set, and the stage is hushed by the weight of its own creation. You are secure in the steady, unhurried peace of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep stillness of the room. As the sensory alchemy of the set establishes a physical rhythm, a new layer of the silent studio experience emerges, the strange, auditory paradox of commanding the silence. To a modern viewer, a silent film set might be imagined as a place of hushed whispers and tiptoeing crews. But the reality of 1920s Hollywood was a symphony of controlled chaos. Because the cameras did not record sound, the set was a vocal and musical battleground. This was the era of the megaphone leadership and the emotional orchestration, where a director could shout instructions during a take and a small band of musicians could play a weeping violin solo just inches from the leading lady's face. This was the anxiety of the auditory wall, the constant need to use noise to create a visual stillness that would eventually haunt the cinema screens of the world. As you settle into the steady, unmoving calm of the evening, imagine the aural landscape of a high-budget dramatic scene. The sound is not silence, but a collision of vibrations. To the left, a mood music ensemble, typically a violinist and a portable harmonium player, is performing a slow, melancholic waltz to help the actors tap into a state of grief or longing. In the center, the director stands with a large tin megaphone, his voice booming over the music to guide the actors' every movement. Now look at the letter. Your heart is breaking. Slow, slower, turn to the light. The air is charged with this directorial pulse. They harbored a secret worry about emotional inertia, the fear that without the melodic trigger, the actors would become wooden or disconnected in the harsh glare of the glass stage. They envisioned a future where sound was the enemy of the set, but in the present, they used volume to produce depth. The role of the on-set musicians was perhaps the most magical element of the silent era. These were the ghost players, musicians who would never be heard by the audience, but whose invisible melodies were etched into every facial twitch and tear on the screen. They understood that music is the shortcut to the soul, a philosophy that turned the drafty stage into a sacred emotional space. They harbored a secret worry about musical mismatch, fearing that if they played a major chord during a minor moment, they would derail the actor's concentration. This created a state of telepathic performance, where the violinist had to watch the actress's eyes as closely as the director did. They used their routine repertoire of standard emotional cues, the misterioso for suspense, the agitato for a chase, to anchor the spirit of the scene. They envisioned a world where actors carried their own music, but for now, the sound was a shared gift. The hidden worries of the director focused on the peril of the vocal overload. While they could shout instructions, they had to be careful not to distort the actor's own internal rhythm. This was the architecture of the megaphone. The director used his voice as a physical force, pushing the performers through the boring technical requirements of the shot while pulling the sublime out of their expressions. They harbored a secret worry that the noise of the set, the hammering of carpenters in the next hut, or the roar of a passing car, would break the spell of the performance. To manage this, they developed a shorthand of the shout, a series of commanding barks that allowed them to conduct the scene like an orchestra. They used the cacophony to insulate the actors from the outside world, creating a dome of sound that held the silence of the story intact. The commanding the silence also involved the physicality of the expressive face, because the actors couldn't use dialogue to convey complex thoughts. They had to rely on a hyper-lucid form of facial acting that was guided by the music. This was the anxiety of the unspoken word. They harbored a secret worry that their inner thoughts would remain unreadable to the camera. To bridge this gap, they synchronized their blinks and sighs to the rhythm of the violin. They envisioned a world where speech would simplify the craft. But in the 1920s, they had to shout through their eyes. They used the melodic direction to paint the internal landscape, turning the loudness of the set into the vibrant quietude of the silver screen. The contrast between the chaotic symphony of noise on the stage and the ghostly stillness of the finished film was the ultimate triumph of the era. The audience would see a tear fall in total silence, never knowing it was prompted by a shouted command and a dusty piano. This separation of the senses was the source of their nocturnal satisfaction. Their fear was not of the noise, but of the emptiness. The thought that if the music stopped, the magic would evaporate, leaving only people in costumes standing in a glass barn. They used the silence of the evening to cool the vocal cords and rest the ears, preparing for the melodic assault of the next day's drama. The megaphones have been replaced by quiet digital monitors, and the on-set violinists have been traded for post-production scores. But the energy of the melodic command remains. The belief that emotion requires a rhythm offers a sense of protective, artistic clarity. You are not responsible for the playing of the violin or the shouting of the cues. You are only a dweller within the enduring, quiet history of the melodic direction, the image of the soaring strings and the booming voice acts as your guide. The rhythm is found, the emotion is captured, and the stage is hushed by the weight of its own unspoken power. You are secure in the steady, unhurried peace of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep stillness of the room. As the era of the glass house reached its atmospheric peak, a new, more aggressive force began to claim the silent stages, the carbon arc glow. This was the moment when Hollywood decided it could no longer wait for the sun. The move from natural, diffused sunlight to the concentrated power of artificial lightning represented a massive technological leap that forever changed the texture of the silver screen. These early lamps, monstrous, hissing devices known as Klieg lights, did not merely illuminate a set, they conquered it. This was the anxiety of the synthetic day, the realization that while electricity offered total control, it came with a violent physical price. They harbored a secret worry that by replacing the sun, they were creating an environment that was fundamentally hostile to the human eye. As you settle into the calm expanse of the evening, imagine a 1925 studio interior. The sound is the persistent, sinister hiss and crackling pop of carbon arcs. The air is charged with scorching dry heat and the acrid, ozone-heavy scent of burning carbon. To look directly at these lamps was to stare into the heart of a star. Cinematographers worried about exposure, volatility, if carbon rods were not adjusted. The light would flicker or die in the middle of a masterpiece. They envisioned a future where light was cool and silent, but in the present they were taming a wild beast with every flip of a switch. The physical toll of this innovation was most famously manifested in the Kligai. Early lamps emitted massive amounts of unfiltered ultraviolet radiation. Actors spent 10 hours a day under their blinding glare. They often returned home with seared retinas and swollen eyelids. They feared permanent darkness, that their career in the light would lead to a life in the shadows. This led to nocturnal recovery with cold, damp tea bags or slices of potato pressed against their eyes to draw out the burning sting. They understood that glamour is a form of endurance, a philosophy that turned the blinding set into a test of the spirit, finding a strange dignity in the red-rimmed eyes of the morning. The hidden worries of the gaffers and electricians focused on the peril of the unseen spark. Sets were a tinderbox of unpainted plywood, dry sawdust, and volatile nitrate film. They worried a spitting arc lamp would ignite the very dreams they were filming. This created a culture of extreme thermal vigilance. They used heavy asbestos gloves to handle scorching lamp housings, and thick cables that snaked across the floor like black serpents. They envisioned a world where safety was a standard, but in the 1920s, they had to wrestle the current into submission. To the crew, the arc lamp was an unpredictable tenant that had to be fed and watched. The technical innovation of the carbon arc birthed the visual language of expressionism. While sunlight was flat and democratic, the arc lamp was directional and dramatic. It allowed cinematographers to sculpt with shadows, creating deep, dreamlike vistas that defined the late silent era. They worried about shadow chaos, fearing unnatural, intersecting silhouettes. To manage this, they developed the architecture of the key light, a philosophy that turned the darkness into a character. They used sharp contrast to reveal the internal soul, turning the blinding glow into a psychological probe. They envisioned a world where light was a paintbrush, and the carbon arc was their heaviest, most vibrant color. The role of the lens filter and the silk diffuser became critical to save the actor's eyes and soften the brutal reality of the electrical light. Crews would hang huge sheets of silk in front of the lamps. This was the anxiety of the hard edge. They understood that beauty requires a veil, a belief that turned the industrial stage into a soft focus dream. Their fear was not of the shadow, but of the glare. The thought that the raw power of the electricity would wash out the humanity. They used routine adjustments of scrims and flags to temper the lightning, finding a meditative peace in the controlled brilliance of the set. The contrast between the violent energy of the lamps and the ethereal beauty of the screen. The audience saw a moonlit balcony or a soft, romantic glow, never knowing it was produced by a hissing, dangerous machine that was melting the makeup off the actor's face. This transmutation of energy was the source of their nocturnal satisfaction. Their fear was not of the heat, but of the invisibility, the thought that the audience would never see the effort behind the flicker. They used the silence of the evening to cool the retinas and rest the mind, preparing for the incandescent assault of the next day's work. Carbon arcs have been replaced by flicker-free HMI and LED arrays. Kligai is a forgotten medical term, but the energy of the synthetic glow remains. The belief that light is the ultimate storyteller offers protective, technical clarity. You are not responsible for feeding carbons or cooling eyes. You are a dweller within the enduring, quiet history of the arclit stage. The image of the crackling light and the long, sculpted shadow acts as your guide. The switch is thrown, the beam is true, and the stage is hushed by its own brilliance. You are secure in the steady, unhurried peace of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep stillness of the room. As the final wrap is called and the hissing carbon arcs are powered down, we must confront the fragile legacy of vanishing emulsion, the heartbreaking reality that the medium was as volatile as the dreams themselves. In the 1920s, cinema was recorded on cellulose nitrate, a substance that was as beautiful as it was dangerous. This was the anxiety of the self-destructing record. Every frame of film was a chemical ticking clock. Nitrate film did not just record history, it consumed it. To work in a film vault was to live in a state of chemical vigilance, knowing that the emulsion of the past was slowly turning into volatile dust, or, worse, a breath of fire that could level a building. As you settle into the calm expanse of the evening, imagine a nitrate film vault. The sound is the heavy, rhythmic clunk of reinforced steel doors, and the faint, metallic hiss of a sophisticated ventilation system. The air is cold, but it carries a sharp, vinegary scent, the unmistakable smell of nitrate decay. This was the architecture of the bunker, because nitrate film is chemically related to gunpowder and can burn even underwater. The legacy of Hollywood was stored in thick-walled concrete cells. Archivists worried about spontaneous combustion, the fear that a single reel would ignite the entire history of the studio. They envisioned a future where images were permanent, but in the present they were guardians of a vanishing ghost. The volatile nature of the emulsion created a cultural selective pressure. Studios often recycled or discarded films once their initial theatrical run was over. They worried that boring records of the past were cluttering the future. This led to historical erasure, where over 80% of the silent era's output has literally turned to dust or been lost to vault fires. They understood that memory is a choice, a philosophy that turned the preservation of a reel into a heroic act of defiance. They used routine inspections to smell the decay, looking for the sticky residue or the brown powder that signaled a movie was dissolving. They envisioned a world where nothing was lost. But for now, the flickering shadows were melting away. The hidden worries of the restoration artists of the mid-2020s focus on the peril of the digital gap as they use high-tech scanners to salvage the last remaining fragments. They are racing against the clock of chemistry. They worry about information loss, fearing the digital reconstruction will lose the organic soul. This created a culture of microscopic precision. They used AI-enhanced algorithms to fill in scratches and pockmarks, turning the shards of the past into vibrant, steady images. They envisioned a world where the 1920s looked like yesterday, a belief that turned the boring work of frame-by-frame cleaning into a resurrection of the spirit. To the restorer, the film strip is a time machine that is falling apart in their hands. The legacy of the vanishing emulsion also established the visual archetypes that still dominate global storytelling today. Because these early creators knew their work was fragile, they built monumental stories. They understood that the image must be iconic to survive, a philosophy that turned the silent actor into a universal symbol. Their fear was not of the decay, but of the forgetting. The thought that the visual language they were inventing would be overwritten. They used the power of the silhouette and the clarity of the gesture to insulate the story from the noise of time. They envisioned a world where the silver screen was eternal, a belief that made the flicker a strobe light for the collective consciousness. The contrast between the violent potential of the film stock and the poetic grace of the performance was the ultimate paradox of early Hollywood. The fire was built into the film, yet the stories were often about softness, romance, and the human heart. This chemical tension was the source of their nocturnal intensity. Their fear was not of the light, but of the darkness, the moment when the last copy of a masterpiece would crackle and vanish, leaving only a boring footnote in a history book. They used the silence of the evening to honor the lost, finding a meditative peace in the recovered frame. They envisioned a world where the dream could never burn, a belief that made the fragile legacy a sacred trust. The nitrate vaults are mostly empty now, replaced by secure digital servers and cold storage acetate. But the energy of the vanishing shadow remains. The belief that what is rare is precious offers clarity. You are not responsible for the monitoring of the decay or the scanning of the frames. You are only a dweller within the enduring, quiet history of the vanishing emulsion. The image of the scratched celluloid and the glowing silver grain acts as your guide. The past is salvaged, the frame is held, and the stage is hushed by the weight of its own survival. You are secure in the steady, unhurried peace of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep stillness of the room. As the morning mist lifts from the San Fernando Valley, the backlot reveals itself as a landscape of structured illusion in the 1920s. A studio lot was not just a collection of buildings, it was a collapsible geography, where a street in revolutionary Paris sat directly behind a dusty outpost in the American West. This was the architecture of the facade, a sprawling, high-stakes construction project where the goal was to build the world out of plywood and plaster. To walk through the backlot was to experience a temporal maze. This was the anxiety of the thin surface, the constant, nagging fear that a single heavy rainstorm or a strong Santa Ana wind would reveal the hollow heart of the cinematic empire. They harbored a secret worry that the grandeur of the image was only as strong as the scaffolding holding it up. As you settle into the steady, unmoving calm of the evening, imagine standing in the middle of a New York City street built entirely of unpainted timber on the reverse side. The sound is the rhythmic hammering of 1,000 carpenters and the crunch of gravel under the wheels of horse-drawn wagons. The air is thick with the scent of fresh sawdust, linseed oil, and the metallic temps of the massive pulleys used to hoist fake mountains into place. The workers harbored a secret worry about physical instability, the fear that a cathedral wall made of burlap and plaster would topple onto a crowd of expensive extras. They envisioned a future where sets were digital and weightless, but in the present they were sculptors of the temporary, slaves to the gravity of the wood. The evolution of the backlot was a study in economic geometry. In the earliest days, sets were flat and two-dimensional, little more than painted backdrops that wobbled in the breeze. But as the silent screen dreams grew in scale, the sets became three-dimensional environments. This was the anxiety of the realistic detail. They harbored a secret worry that if the camera lingered too long on a marble pillar, the audience would see the wood grain beneath the paint. This led to the creation of the master craftsman culture. They used plaster of Paris to mimic ancient stone and charred wood to simulate centuries of history. They envisioned a world where the fake was more real than the true. A belief that turned the boring labor of the construction crew into a mission of alchemy. To the carpenter, the set was not a building. It was a portrait of a place. The architecture of the backlot created a unique psychological pressure for the set dresser. Because the sets were often modular, a single street might be redressed 3 times in a single week, transforming from a London slum to a Viennese plaza overnight. This was the anxiety of the residual detail. They harbored a secret worry that a modern telephone pole would accidentally appear in the background of a biblical epic. To manage this, they developed a hypervigilance of the eye. They used potted palms, false storefronts, and carefully placed shadows to mask the reality of the California hills. They envisioned a world where the background was infinite, but in the 1920s, they had to wall off the world with plywood and paint. They used the routine of the rebuild to steady the mind, finding a meditative peace in the constant state of change. The backlot also functioned as a microcity with its own internal logic and hierarchy. Beneath the plywood facades lay a grid of support: plumbing for artificial rain, wiring for nighttime illumination, and stable blocks for the hundreds of animals required for the spectacles. They harbored a secret worry about logistical collapse, fearing that the simulated world would become more complex than the real one. They used their routine inspections of the bracing and the beams to insulate the illusion, believing that safety is the parent of the dream. They envisioned a world where sets were permanent, but until then, they found strength in the temporary. To the worker, the backlot was a living organism that required constant feeding and repair. The contrast between the profound beauty of the camera's view and the raw skeletal reality of the construction was the ultimate source of their nocturnal fatigue. They lived in a world where nothing was as it seemed. Their fear was not of the illusion, but of the exposure, the moment when the fourth wall would crumble and reveal the boring California sun behind a night in Baghdad. They used the silence of the evening to cool the saws and sweep the shavings, preparing the wooden world for the next impossible dream. They envisioned a world where artifice was invisible, a belief that made the backlot a monument to the imagination, built on a foundation of plywood. The great backlots have mostly been paved over for office buildings and sound stages, and the plywood world is now a digital file, but the energy of the constructed dream remains. The belief that we can build the world we want to see offers a sense of protective architectural clarity. You are not responsible for the bracing of the walls or the painting of the plaster. You are only a dweller within the enduring, quiet history of the plywood backlot. The image of the unpainted timber and the glowing plaster facade acts as your guide. The street is built, the paint is dry, and the stage is hushed by the scale of its own artifice. You are secure in the steady, unhurried peace of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep stillness of the room. As the artificial suns of the carbon arc lamps dim and the laborers retreat from the plywood streets, a different kind of construction remains illuminated in the Hollywood night, the architecture of identity. In the 1920s, the star system was not a natural byproduct of talent, but a meticulously engineered human infrastructure designed by the studios. This was the era where a person's very existence, their name, their past, their romantic preferences, and even their physical silhouette was treated as a studio asset to be drafted and built like a set. This was the anxiety of the synthetic self, the realization that the icon on the silver screen was a carefully curated ghost that lived in a world of absolute perfection, while the human being beneath was left to wander the shadows of the persona. They harbored a secret worry that the mask would eventually fuse with the face, leaving no room for the original soul to breathe. As you settle into the steady, unmoving calm of the evening, imagine the atmosphere of the studio publicity department in the late hours of a Tuesday. The sound is the rapid-fire staccato of a dozen typewriters churning out biographical fictions, and the soft shuffle of glossy, made-by-10 photographs being sorted into piles. The air is thick with the scent of fresh ink, tobacco smoke, and the sweet, floral perfume favored by the leading ladies of the era. The publicists harbored a secret worry about personal inconsistency, the fear that a star's human impulses would shatter the architecture of their public identity. They envisioned a future where celebrity was a transparent truth, but in the present, they were architects of the ideal, turning ordinary people into immortal archetypes. The creation of a star was a study in biological editing. When a young hopeful arrived at the studio gates, they were immediately deconstructed. Their name was often changed to something more melodic or statuesque. Their hairline might be adjusted with painful electrolysis, and their teeth were perfected with early This was the anxiety of the erasure. The actors harbored a secret worry that they were vanishing, piece by piece, being replaced by a sculpture of light and shadow. This led to a state of performance vigilance, where they had to maintain the star persona even when buying groceries or walking their dogs. They understood that privacy is the price of immortality, a philosophy that turned their homes into miniature movie sets, where every piece of furniture was vetted for its contribution to the brand. They used their routine social appearances to reinforce the lie, finding a strange safety in the artificiality of the role. The hidden worries of studio moguls focused on the peril of the moral breach. In the 1920s, morality clauses were drafted with legal precision. They knew the star system rested on public trust. Any human scandal was a strategic catastrophe for their empire. A secret worry, private desires of their assets, might clash with the audience's puritanical expectations. To manage this, they built the architecture of the cover-up. Private investigators and informants formed a pre-digital firewall. They envisioned unbreakable reputations. But in the 1920s, secrets were guarded with gold and silence. To executives, a star was not a person. They were a fragile glass ornament, needing constant padding. The architecture of identity demanded visual consistency. Stars like Valentino or Gish maintained a specific emotional frequency, always. This was the anxiety of the typecast. They feared being trapped in a single expression, a prisoner of the look. To bridge ambition and image, they developed a language of the micro-dash gesture. Single quotes, subtle head tilts, or lingering glances allowed them to sneak their true selves into performances. They dreamed of chameleon actors, but in the silent era, they were monuments of a single feeling. They used the routine of the close-up to anchor their power, turning restriction into divine focus. Fan magazines and gossip columns decorated the architecture of the persona, providing plaster and paint for the plywood life. This was the anxiety of the parasitic narrative. They knew the audience wants to belong to the star. Their fear was not exposure, but indifference. If the story stopped, the star would fall. Routine interviews leaked the perfect truth, finding quiet pride in the seamlessness of the fabrication. They envisioned fame as a conversation, but found joy in the broadcast. Until then, the contrast, godlike stature of the icon versus fragile reality of the individual, on screen, larger than life, but in the silence of the night, they were tired, isolated, and governed by contracts that owned their names. This dual existence caused nocturnal fatigue. Their fear was not fame, but vacancy. They used the silence of the evening to shed the persona, ensuring architecture of identity remained professional armor. Old studio contracts expired. Publicity evolved to social media, but the energy of the constructed icon remains. The belief we are what the world sees offers protective clarity. You're not responsible for the image. You are a dweller within the enduring, quiet history of the constructed star. The glossy photograph and perfected silhouette guide you. The brand is built, the face is set, the stage is hushed by its mythology. You are secure in the steady, unhurried peace of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep stillness of the room. As the backlot fades, the camera shifts from grand spectacle to the intimate landscape of the human face. This was the laboratory of emotion, where early Hollywood discovered a performer's skin could be vast and dramatic. In the 1920s, the close-up was not just technical, it was a psychological invasion. For the first time, an audience saw the microscopic vibration of a tear or silent collapse of hope. This was the anxiety of the magnified soul, realizing nowhere to hide under the unforgiving gaze. They worried closeness would strip the mystery, leaving only geometry and biology. Settle into the calm of evening. Imagine a close-up set in a quiet corner of a glass stage. The sound is not clatter of the crew, but a deep, expectant silence, broken by a single arc lamp hiss. The air is stagnant and hot, smelling of warmed grease paint and metallic dry dust of the velvet backdrop. Cinematographers worried about focal instability. A fraction of an inch could blur emotional truth. They envisioned automatic focus, but were navigators of the millimeter, turning sharpness of the eye into measure of the heart. The psychology of the close-up was a study in visual empathy. Theater grief was a broadcast of the body, but in the laboratory of the studio, grief was a whisper of the features. This was the anxiety of the minimalist. Actors worried doing too much or not enough, fearing a simple blink would look like a seismic shift. This led to internalized performance, where the goal was not to act, but to think. They understood the camera reads the mind, turning the silent face into a transparent window. They used routine concentration to hold a single thought, finding meditative intensity in immobility of the frame. The hidden worries of lighting directors focused on the peril of the texture, every pore, line, and unintended shadow amplified. They worried brutal reality of the skin would distract from the beauty of the dream. To manage this, they invented the architecture of the catchlight, a brilliant reflection giving inner life or divine fire. They used Vaseline on the lens or gauze filters to soften the edges of reality, turning the human face into a soft, focused landscape. They envisioned flawlessness as a default, but had to manufacture the glow through glass and silk. To the gaffer, the face was not a subject, it was a surface for the manipulation of light. The laboratory of emotion also pioneered the language of the gaze. No words, so direction of the eyes became primary grammar. This was the anxiety of the unseen object. They worried the audience wouldn't understand what the actor was seeing. To bridge this, they developed the Kuleshov effect, realizing meaning of a face changed with the image that followed it. They envisioned editing as the ultimate director, but on set trusted the power of the stare. They used the routine of the long take to exhaust the ego, allowing vulnerability of the person to seep through the mask. The contrast, clinical coldness of the camera versus raw heat of the emotion. The actor was isolated, surrounded by shouting directors and sweating technicians, yet producing an intimate moment like a private confession. This emotional compartmentalization caused nocturnal fatigue. Their fear was not exposure, but dryness. The moment when tears wouldn't come and the face would remain a blank map. They used the silence of the evening to repopulate the inner world, ensuring laboratory of emotion remained a place of discovery. The close-up is now a standard tool of every smartphone and sitcom, but the energy of intimate discovery remains. The belief that the soul is visible in the eyes offers a sense of protective, psychological clarity. You are only a dweller within the enduring, quiet history of the intimate lens. The image of the glowing eye and the trembling lip acts as your guide. The focus is sharp, the thought is clear, and the stage is hushed by the power of its own vulnerability. As the moon casts a long, quiet light over the studio gates, it illuminates the often overlooked history of the silent vanguard. The women and minority pioneers were the hidden architects of the silver screen's first golden age. In the 1920s, before the studio system became rigid, the glass enclosures were a chaotic frontier. The rules of who could lead were still being written in pencil. This was a brief, vibrant window of social fluidity. Women like Alice Guy Blakey, Lois Weber, and Frances Marion held immense creative power. They were directors, producers, and the highest-paid screenwriters in the world. This was the anxiety of the unmapped path, inventing a new art form and testing society's boundaries. They worried that as the industry matured, the gates would close on those who didn't fit the executive mold. Imagine the atmosphere of a writing hut or a scenario department headed by a woman in 1923. The sound is the persistent, rhythmic clacking of typewriters and the low, intense murmur of story conferences. The air is charged with feverish creative energy, smelling of expensive stationery, cold tea, lavender, and ink. These pioneers worried about historical erasure, fearing their foundational contributions would be attributed to men. They envisioned a future where credit was a permanent record, but were ghostwriters of a new reality, turning their excluded perspectives into the universal language of the screen. The role of minority pioneers in this era was a study in resilient ingenuity. Independent creators like Oscar Micheaux and the Noble brothers built their own parallel cinema. This was the architecture of the independent lot. They worried about resource depletion, making masterpieces on a shoestring, using expired film stock or borrowed cameras. They understood that representation is a form of survival, turning low-budget sets into fortresses of dignity. They found a meditative peace in the purity of their message. They envisioned a world where the screen reflected every face, a belief that made their flickering shadows a beacon of hope. The architecture of the silent vanguard also involved the technical mastery of the craft. Women were not just muses, they were editors and negative cutters, roles requiring surgical precision. They worried about the peril of the physical slip, fearing a misplaced cut would ruin a priceless performance. This led to a culture of extreme rhythmic vigilance. They used the light of the editing table to find the soul of the movie, turning raw footage into a fluid dream. They envisioned a world where the hand that cut the film was as respected as the hand that held the camera. A belief that made the boring work of the cutting room a sacred ritual of timing. The contrast between the inclusive spirit of the early huts and the exclusive future of the sound era was their nocturnal fatigue. They could feel the shifting of the gears as the industry became a multi-million-dollar machine that preferred uniformity over variety. Their fear was not of the work, but of the shuddering, when their voices would be muted by the roar of the talkies and the rise of the boardrooms. They used the silence of the night to reread their scripts, ensuring the vanguard remained a guiding force. In the shadows of the industry, they envisioned a world where merit was the only currency, a belief that made their early freedom a cherished memory. The names of many pioneers were lost for decades, only to be resurrected by digital restoration efforts of the 2020s. But the energy of the inclusive dream remains. The belief that everyone has a story worth telling offers a sense of protective, social clarity. You are only a dweller within the enduring, quiet history of the silent vanguard. The image of the unbroken typewriter ribbon and the focused gaze of the editor acts as your guide. The story is written, the cut is true, and the stage is hushed by the power of its own diversity. As the sun rises over the backlot, it illuminates the most dangerous geography of early Hollywood, the architecture of the stunt. In the 1920s, there were no green screens, no computer-generated physics, and very few safety nets. If a script called for an actor to hang from a clock face 10 stories above a city street, or to leap between moving trains, the physical reality of the act had to be built in the real world. This was the era of the pragmatic daredevil, defying gravity through brute courage and mechanical ingenuity. This was the anxiety of the unyielding pavement, the constant realization that the price of a mistake was absolute. They worried that the thirst for the spectacle would eventually consume the artist. Imagine the atmosphere of a stunt construction site on a high-rise set. The sound is the howl of the wind through exposed girders and the ominous creak of counterweighted pulleys. The air is thin and cold, smelling of greased iron, hemp rope, and the sharp, metallic scent of high-altitude fear. The stunt coordinators worried about mechanical fatigue, fearing a single frayed strand in a piano wire would snap. They envisioned a future where danger was an illusion, but were architects of the edge, turning the risk of the fall into the poetry of the movement. The stunt was a study in mathematical precision. For legends like Buster Keaton or Harold Lloyd, a comedy of errors was actually a ballet of geometry. They worried about timing drift, knowing that if a collapsing house facade missed its mark, slapstick would turn into tragedy. This led to a state of extreme kinetic vigilance, where every brick and board was weighed and measured for its predictability in flight. They understood that comedy is a serious business, a philosophy that turned the spectacle of the fall into a masterpiece of engineering. They found a meditative peace in the laws of physics. They envisioned a world where luck was a science, a belief that made the death-defying act a disciplined prayer. The hidden worries of the camera operators focused on the peril of the missed frame. To capture a stunt, the camera often had to be positioned in the path of danger or mounted to a swaying crane. They worried that their technical error, a jammed magazine or a soft focus, would force the actor to repeat the risk. This created a culture of zero-error reliability. They used hand-cranked focus to track the descent, turning the mechanical capture into a sympathetic heartbeat. They envisioned a world where multiple cameras covered every angle, but in the 1920s, they had to get it right in one. To the cinematographer, the stunt was not an action. It was a fleeting window of truth that could never be reopened. The architecture of the stunt also involved the psychology of the audience. The early creators understood that the thrill came from the knowledge that it was real. This was the anxiety of the authenticity. They worried that as the tricks of the trade became more sophisticated, the audience would stop believing in the physical sacrifice. To bridge this gap, they often included wide shots that showed the entire environment, proving there were no wires and no nets. They envisioned a world where seeing was believing, but they lived in a world where believing required a sacrifice. They used the routine of the preparation to insulate the nerves, turning the fear of the height into the exhilaration of the flight. The contrast between the playful spirit of comedy and the lethal potential of physics was the ultimate paradox of the silent thriller. A man would slip on a banana peel and fall into a river, and the audience would laugh, never knowing the water was freezing and the current was deadly. This separation of the result and the risk was the source of their nocturnal intensity. Their fear was not of the stunt, but of the stagnation. The thought that if they stopped pushing the limit, the magic of the cinema would flatten and die. They used the silence of the evening to reset the bones and check the ropes, ensuring that the architecture of the stunt remained a foundation of the thrill. The clock faces are now in museums, and the falling houses are rendered in pixels, but the energy of the physical dare remains. The belief that greatness requires a risk offers a sense of protective, kinetic clarity. You are not responsible for the checking of the pulleys or the timing of the fall. You are only a dweller within the enduring, quiet history of the silent thrill. The image of the swinging rope and the steady gaze of the acrobat acts as your guide. The leap is made, the landing is safe, and the stage is hushed by its own audacity. You are secure in the steady, unhurried peace of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep stillness of the room. As the silver screen dreams were being manufactured within the glass cathedrals of Hollywood, a parallel architectural revolution was taking place in the cities and towns where those dreams were eventually consumed. This was the rise of the movie theater. But to call these structures theaters is to undersell their intended impact. They were dream palaces, vast, ornate, and often surreal monuments to the experience of the image. In the 1920s, the act of going to the movies was not a casual decision. It was a pilgrimage to the sublime. This was the architecture of the threshold, a high-stakes transition from the gritty, gray reality of post-industrial life to a sacred space of gold, leaf, velvet, and flickering light. They harbored a secret worry that if the palace was not grand enough, the flicker on the screen would lose its divine authority. As you settle into the steady, unmoving calm of the evening, imagine standing under the soaring marquee of a 1926 grand cinema. The sound is the low, expectant hum of 1,000 patrons and the rhythmic, distant, muffled pulse of the theater's massive Wurlitzer organ warming up in the pit. The air is thick with the scent of expensive cigar smoke, damp wool coats, sweet popcorn, and the heavy scent of projectors, cooling fans. The theater managers harbored a secret worry about psychological disruption, the fear that a drafty door or a flickering exit sign would break the trance of the audience. They envisioned a future where the theater vanished into the movie, but in the present, the building was the first act. They used uniformed ushers and marble staircases to insulate the audience from the outside world. turning the act of sitting into a royal reception. The architecture of the Dream Palace was a study in thematic escapism. Unlike the functional theaters of today, these palaces were often built in atmospheric styles: Chinese pagodas, Mayan temples, or Persian gardens. This was the anxiety of the mundane. The architects harbored a secret worry that the ordinary world was too boring to sustain the cinematic imagination. This led to the creation of the false sky, ceilings painted deep midnight blue, embedded with tiny electric stars, and moving clouds projected by a machine called a brenograph. They understood that wonder is a physical environment, a philosophy that turned the ceiling of the theater into a portal to the infinite. They used their routine maintenance of the star lamps to anchor the illusion, finding a meditative peace in the artificial heavens. They envisioned a world where man-made light was more beautiful than the sun. The hidden worries of the projectionists focused on the peril of the focal point, locked away in a lead-lined booth at the top of the palace. They were the unseen masters of the light. They harbored a secret worry about film drift, knowing that if the nitrate stock buckled even slightly under the heat of the lamp, the faces of the gods on the screen would turn into blurred specters. This created a culture of extreme optical vigilance. They used hand-adjusted carbon arcs to push the image across the vast distance of the hall, turning the mechanical projection into a sympathetic performance. They envisioned a world where machines never failed. But in the 1920s, they had to wrestle the light into every frame. To the projectionist, the Dream Palace was not a building. It was a giant camera in reverse. The architecture of the Dream Palace also involved the social alchemy of the dark. For the first time, people of all classes sat together in the same darkness, watching the same dream. This was the anxiety of the unfiltered crowd. They harbored a secret worry that the communal experience would be disrupted by the human element. To bridge this gap, they built private boxes and plush smoking lounges, providing tiers of luxury within the democracy of the dark. They envisioned a world where the movie brought the world together. But they lived in a world where the theater had to manage the world. They used the routine of the usher's flashlight to patrol the piece, turning the silence of the audience into a measured respect. The role of the Wurlitzer organist was to decorate the architecture with sound. The organ was not just an instrument. It was a theatrical machine capable of mimicking thunder, birdsong, and sirens. This was the anxiety of the sonic gap. They understood that silence is too heavy for the heart to carry alone. A philosophy that turned the vibrations of the pipe into an emotional floor for the audience. Their fear was not of the wrong note, but of the wrong mood. The thought that a major key would cheapen a tragic death. They used their routine of the ascending organ lift to elevate the energy, finding a quiet pride in the physicality of the sound. They envisioned a world where music was built into the film, but until then, they found joy in the live accompaniment. The contrast between the glittering gold of the lobby and the flickering gray of the screen was the ultimate paradox of the Dream Palace. The audience walked through a palace of reality to reach a temple of shadow. This inversion of value was the source of their nocturnal satisfaction. Their fear was not of the movie, but of the ending. The moment when the lights would come up and the dream would vanish, leaving only the boring walk to the trolley stop. They used the silence of the evening to vacuum the velvet and polish the brass, ensuring that the Dream Palace remained a fortress of the extraordinary. The great palaces have mostly been subdivided or demolished, and the artificial stars have been extinguished by multiplex efficiency, but the energy of the sacred cinema remains. The belief that the place where we dream matters offers a sense of protective, architectural clarity. You are not responsible for the maintenance of the marquee or the threading of the projector. You are only a dweller within the enduring, quiet history of the dream palace. The image of the glowing velvet and the beam of light through the dust acts as your guide. The curtain is up, the organ is playing, and the stage is hushed by the scale of its own magnificence. You are secure in the steady, unhurried peace of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep stillness of the room. As the final rap is called and the dream palaces across the country begin their late-night screenings, a second, more shadowed existence begins on the Hollywood lot, the silent night to the public. The studio was a place of glitter and noise, but after midnight, it transformed into a ghostly industrial park of monumental stillness. This was the architecture of the aftermath, the time when the labor of the day was processed and the illusions of tomorrow were staged in the dark. This was the anxiety of the static image, the realization that without the light and the movement, the great sets were just decaying, timber and hollow shells. They harbored a secret worry that the magic would evaporate, moonlight, leaving nothing but the boring reality of a business enterprise. As you settle into the steady, unmoving calm of the evening, imagine walking through the backlot, clatter of the camera, but the haunting whistle of the wind through the unpainted rafters of a London street and the rhythmic drip of a leaky fire hydrant. The air is chilly and damp, smelling of cooling asphalt, pine resin, and the sharp, metallic scent of the night watchman's flashlight. The watchman harbored a secret worry about trespassers of the mind, the fear that fans or rivals would breach the wire to steal a fragment of the secret. They envisioned a future where security was invisible but in the present. They were guardians of the void, patrolling the border between the dream and the dirt. The silent night was a study in industrial maintenance, while the actors slept in their personally branded mansions. The night crews moved in like spectral cleaners. This was the anxiety of the invisible hand. They harbored a secret worry that one stray hammer or one forgotten oily rag would corrupt the frame of the morning's first shot. This led to the creation of the Order of the Sweep. They used huge push brooms to clear the sawdust and cigarette butts from the stages, turning the debris of the performance into a blank slate. They understood that perfection requires a reset, a philosophy that turned the boring act of janitorial work into a sacred preparation. They used their routine path through the darkened huts to insulate history, finding a meditative peace in the emptiness of the space. They envisioned a world where sets were self-cleaning, but for now, the dream required a broom. The hidden worries of the laboratory. Technicians focused on the peril of the chemical dark. In the film lab, the night shift worked in a perpetual red glow, developing the negative from the day's shoot. They harbored a secret worry about batch variance, knowing that a slight shift in the temperature of the developer bath would pervert the skin tones of the world's most famous faces. This created a culture of extreme chemical vigilance. They used timed immersion and precision thermometers to fix the image forever, turning the fragile emulsion into a permanent record. They envisioned a world where development was instant, but in the 1920s, they had to nurture the shadows in the dark. To the lab tech, the night was not a time. It was a chemical necessity. The life of the studio after dark also involved the psychology of the writer. In this scenario, huts, the midnight lamp burned as writers struggled to solve the plot for the next day's filming. This was the anxiety of the empty page. They harbored a secret worry that their words would be swallowed by the silence of the screen. To bridge this gap, they developed a visual shorthand, a way of writing in pictures that the director could shout through a megaphone. They envisioned a world where writers were the masters, but they lived in a world where the image was the law. They used the silence of the night to distill the emotion, finding a quiet pride in the unspoken dialogue. They envisioned a world where stories were written in light, a belief that made the midnight oil a sacred fuel. The role of the animal handlers and the stable masters was to manage the pulse of the backlot. In the quiet of the night, the hundreds of horses, camels, and lions used in the spectacles had to be fed and calmed. This was the anxiety of the wild element. They understood that the camera is a predator, a philosophy that turned the animal into a nervous performer. Their fear was not of the bite, but of the exhaustion, the thought that the creatures would wilt under the lights. They used their routine of the nightly walk to steady the animals, finding a meditative peace in the simple biology of the lot. They envisioned a world where animals were replaced by machines, but until then, they found joy in the living presence. The contrast between the frenetic energy of the noonday shoot and the stark loneliness of the midnight patrol was the ultimate paradox of the studio. The Palace of Baghdad was a masterpiece at 12, and a collection of junk at 2. This cyclical death and rebirth was the source of their nocturnal fatigue. Their fear was not of the dark, but of the stagnation. The moment when the sun would rise and the magic would not return. They used the silence of the evening to reset the stage, ensuring that the silent night remained a place of incubation, rather than a place of abandonment. The night crews have been replaced by automated systems and overnight digital transfers, and the stables are now parking structures, but the energy of the midnight preparation remains. The belief that the dream is built while the world sleeps offers a sense of protective industrial clarity. You are not responsible for the sweeping of the sawdust or the development of the negative. You are only a dweller within the enduring, quiet history of the studio after dark. The image of the unpainted timber and the glow of the lab lamp acts as your guide. The negative is fixed, the set is clean, and the stage is hushed by the expectation of the dawn. You are secure in the steady, unhurried peace of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep stillness of the room. As the moon hangs high over the silent stages, we turn our attention to the architecture of the wardrobe, the literal fabric of the dream that draped the icons of the 1920s in an atmosphere of material grandeur. In the silent era, a costume was not merely clothing. It was a structural necessity designed to communicate character, status, and emotion in the absence of a single spoken word. This was the era of the tactile narrative, where the weight of a velvet train or the shimmer of a hand-bedded flapper dress functioned as a visual monologue. To enter the wardrobe department of a major studio was to step into a cathedral of textiles, a place where the anxiety of the surface was managed with needles, thread, and an obsessive devotion to the weave. They harbored a secret worry that if the fabric failed, the illusion of the star would unravel into a boring collection of seams and zippers as you settle into the steady, unmoving calm of the evening. Imagine the atmosphere of the wardrobe room in the deep hours of the night. The sound is not the click of the camera, but the soft, rhythmic snip of silver shears and the hissing steam of heavy industrial irons. The air is thick with the scent of mothballs, lavender sachets, freshly dyed silk, and the metallic temps. The seamstresses and designers harbored a secret worry about chromatographic betrayal. The fear that a brilliant red gown would translate into a muddy, flat gray on the orthochromatic film stock of the day. They envisioned a future where color was a reality, but in the present, they were engineers of the grayscale, choosing fabrics for their reflective index rather than their true hue. They used beading and embroidery to create topographical interest on the surface of the body, turning the act of dressing into a sculptural event. The architecture of the wardrobe was a study in physical endurance, for the historical epic costumes were often built using authentic weight, heavy wools, real leather, and metallic armor. This was the anxiety of the burden. The actors harbored a secret worry that the mass of the costume would extinguish their performance, fearing they would become mannequins, trapped in a textile prison. This led to the development of ergonomic artifice. Designers like Adrian or Travis Banton would counterweight massive headpieces with hidden wires to save the actress's neck from permanent strain. They understood that glamour is a form of engineering, a philosophy that turned the silk gown into a feat of structural integrity. They used their routine fittings to balance the weight, finding a meditative peace in the symmetry of the stitch. They envisioned a world where costumes were light as air, but for now, the dream had a physical weight. The role of the lace maker and the beater was to decorate the dream with light. In the silence of the workshop, they hand-sewed thousands of tiny glass beads onto chiffon, knowing that each one would catch a photon from the arc lamps and throw it back to the camera. This was the anxiety of the static surface. They understood that the camera loves movement, a philosophy that turned a simple walk into a shimmering event. Their fear was not of the labor, but of the dullness. The thought that the star would vanish into the flat background of the plywood set. They used their routine of the needle and thread to create the sparkle, finding a quiet pride in the brilliance of the result. They envisioned a world where light was artificial and easy, but until then, they found joy in the handmade glow. The contrast between the fragility of the silk and the brutality of the studio environment was the ultimate paradox of the wardrobe department. A dress made of breath and glass had to survive a desert dust storm or a simulated shipwreck. This material resilience was the source of their nocturnal intensity. Their fear was not of the ruin, but of the shabbiness. The moment when the audience would see the sweat through the satin. They used the silence of the evening to clean and press, ensuring that the fabric of the dream remained untouched by reality. The wardrobe huts have been replaced by global fashion, partnerships, and digital textures, and the Hand beating is now a lost art of the specialized house, but the energy of the tactile illusion remains. The belief that we are the skin we show offers a sense of protective, material clarity. You are not responsible for the sewing of the beads or the pressing of the silk. You are only a dweller within the enduring, quiet history of the wardrobe architecture. The image of the shimmering satin and the unbroken thread acts as your guide. The fit is perfect, the seam is strong, and the stage is hushed by the beauty of its own attire. You are secure in the steady, unhurried peace of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep stillness of the room. Section 14. The director's vision, the absolute rule of the silent stage. As the sun rises over the glass enclosures, it illuminates the most singular force in the early studio, the director's vision. In the 1920s, the director was not just a collaborator. They were the absolute monarch of the set, because there was no sound recordist to worry about, and no script supervisor to enforce dialogue. The director was free to sculpt the scene in using their voice and their presence to conduct the performance. This was the era of the auteur as architect, where the goal was to command the space and will the image into existence. This was the anxiety of total control, the realization that the success or failure of the silver screen dream rested entirely on the internal clarity of one person's mind. They harbored a secret worry that if their vision flickered, the entire machinery of the studio would grind to a boring halt as you settle into the steady, unmoving calm of the evening. Imagine the atmosphere of a director's chair positioned in the center of a high-stakes dramatic shoot. The sound is the booming resonance of the megaphone and the sharp, commanding snap of the director's fingers. The air is charged with a heavy electric tension, smelling of strong black coffee, expensive cologne, and the burning carbon of the lights. The directors harbored a secret worry about visionary blindness, the fear that they would lose the thread of the silent story in the chaos of the construction. They envisioned a future where the director was a facilitator, but in the present, they were dictators of the soul, turning the physical movements of the actors into a visual symphony. They used their absolute authority to insulate the set from the outside world, creating a dome of will that held the dream intact. The absolute rule was a study in emotional conducting. For directors like D.W. Griffith, Rex Ingram, or Erich von Stroheim, the set was a musical instrument. They harbored a secret worry about rhythmic dissonance, knowing that if an actor's breath was out of sync with the pacing of the scene, the truth would be lost. This led to the development of the dictated performance, where the director would act out the roles behind the camera, demanding that the performers mirror their intensity. They understood that vision is a physical transmission, a philosophy that turned the shouting of cues into a biological connection. They used their routine of the endless retake to break the ego of the star, finding a meditative peace in the purity of the result. They envisioned a world where actors were autonomous, but in the silent era, they were clay in the director's hands. The hidden worries of the assistant directors focused on the peril of the human friction in the boring but essential world of management. They had to buffer the director's ego from the realities of the budget. They harbored a secret worry that a moment of directorial rage or a perfectionist delay would bankrupt the studio. This created a culture of diplomatic vigilance. They used schedules and logistics to channel the vision into the possible, turning the impossible dream into a manageable workday. They envisioned a world where art had no price, but in the 1920s, they had to weigh the light against the gold. To the assistant, the director was not a boss. They were a natural disaster that had to be guided and contained. The absolute rule of the silent stage also involved the psychology of the presence. The director's physical appearance, the puttees, the riding crop, the pith helmet, was a costume of authority designed to intimidate the chaos. This was the anxiety of the imposter. They harbored a secret worry that if they looked ordinary, they would lose the command to bridge this gap. They developed a language of the persona. They used grand gestures and unyielding stares to anchor the power of the stage. They envisioned a world where authority was a shared burden, but in the silent era, it was a solitary throne. They used the routine of the set to insulate the doubt, finding a quiet pride in the absolute nature of the craft. The role of the continuity clerk was to document the monarch's whim in the silence of the observation. They recorded every movement of a hand and every position of a glass, knowing that the director's memory was the only law. This was the anxiety of the inconsistency. They understood that logic is the servant of the vision, a philosophy that turned technical accuracy into a tribute to the master. Their fear was not of the error, but of the shaming, the thought that the director would find a flaw in their vigilance. They used their routine of the notebook and the stopwatch to guard the vision, finding a quiet pride in the seamlessness of the continuity. They envisioned a world where computers remembered everything, but until then, they found joy in the human record. The contrast between the godlike certainty of the director and the fragile reality of the collaborative art was the ultimate paradox of the silent stage. The director owned the image, but they needed 1,000 hands to build the light. This interdependence of the ego was the source of their nocturnal intensity. Their fear was not of the critic, but of the obsolescence, the moment when the vision would no longer reach the audience. They used the silence of the evening to reread the scenario, ensuring that the absolute rule remained a force for the dream rather than a force for the ego. The megaphones are now in museums, and the riding crops have been replaced by quiet earpieces, but the energy of the singular vision remains. The belief that art requires a leader offers a sense of protective, directorial clarity. You are not responsible for the commanding of the extras or the conducting of the scene. You are only a dweller within the enduring, quiet history of the director's stage. The image of the outstretched hand and the steady gaze acts as your guide. The command is given, the vision is set, and the stage is hushed by the power of its own direction. You are secure in the steady, unhurried peace of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep stillness of the room. As the midnight oil burns in the small, clapboard bungalows lining the studio's edge, we enter the architecture of the script, the foundational blueprint of the silver screen dream that had to be built without a single audible word. In the 1920s, screenwriting was a radical experiment in visual shorthand. A screenwriter, or scenario writer, was not a playwright who focused on the rhythmic beauty of dialogue. They were engineers of the image. Their task was to construct a narrative skeleton that could be understood by a farmer in Nebraska and a merchant in Tokyo simultaneously, using only the universal grammar of action. This was the anxiety of the unspoken thought, the constant, haunting challenge of conveying complex human motives, internal monologues, and subtle ironies through geometry and gesture. They harbored a secret worry that if their visual logic was not airtight, the silence of the screen would become a void of confusion. As you settle into the steady, unmoving calm of the evening, imagine the atmosphere of a scenario hut at 2 a.m. The sound is not the clatter of the set, but the persistent, lonely strike of a typewriter key and the soft crumple of paper being tossed into a mounting pile. The air is stale and warm, smelling of bitter ink, cold coffee, and the faint, papery dust of 1,000 discarded drafts. These writers harbored a secret worry about descriptive impotence, the fear that they could not find the right sequence of pictures to represent a broken heart or a shattering realization. They envisioned a future where speech would solve the puzzle, but in the present, they were sculptors of the gaze, turning emotions into events. They used vivid, telegraphic prose to paint for the director's eye, turning the act of writing into a blueprint for light. The architecture of the script was a study in structural pacing, without the filler of dialogue. Every cut and every transition had to carry the weight of the story. This was the anxiety of the momentum. They harbored a secret worry that the audience's eye would wander if the visual rhythm faltered for even a second. This led to the creation of the sight gag and the visual metaphor. A writer like Anita Loos or Frances Marion understood that a lingering shot of a wilting flower could replace 3 pages of a tragic soliloquy. They understood that brevity is the soul of the silent screen, a philosophy that turned the written page into a manual for movement. They used their routine of the scene breakdown to calculate the emotional impact, finding a meditative peace in the purity of the sequence. They envisioned a world where scripts were thick and wordy, but for now, they found strength in the lean, visual bone. The hidden worries of the intertitle writers focused on the peril of the interruption. These specialists were brought in to write the cards that appeared between shots to provide essential dialogue or contextual explanation. They harbored a secret worry about literary intrusion, fearing that too many words would break the spell of the cinematic trance. This created a culture of extreme verbal economy. They used punchy, evocative phrases to bridge the silence, turning the printed word into a musical cue. They envisioned a world where voices were recorded, but in the 1920s, they had to nurture the font with wit and restraint. To the intertitle writer, the word was not a speech. It was a graphic element that had to support the image without smothering it. The architecture of the script also involved the psychology of the universal audience, because the silent film traveled the world without the need for complex dubbing or translation. The script had to be culturally transparent. This was the anxiety of the particular. They harbored a secret worry that a local gesture or a slang visual would confuse the global viewer. To bridge this gap, they developed a language of archetypes: the hero, the villain, the mother, the clown. They envisioned a world where national boundaries were dissolved by the flicker, a belief that made their writing a diplomatic mission. They used the routine of the story arc to insulate the human truth, finding a quiet pride in the universality of the silent gesture. The role of the script doctor was to re-engineer the dream when it stalled on the screen. In the silence of the screening room, they watched the rough cuts, looking for the logic gaps that only a new scene or a new title could fix. This was the anxiety of the fragment. They understood that a movie is made 3 times: in the writing, the shooting, and the editing, a philosophy that turned failure into a technical problem. Their fear was not of the flaw, but of the boring stretch. The moment when the audience would realize they were sitting in a theater. They used their routine of the rewrite to sharpen the focus, finding a quiet pride in the seamlessness of the fix. They envisioned a world where the first draft was the last, but until then, they found joy in the repair. The contrast between the quiet solitude of the hut and the global impact of the image was the ultimate paradox of the screenwriter. A single visual idea typed in the dark of Hollywood would eventually move 1 million people in Paris, Berlin, and Shanghai. This reach was the source of their nocturnal satisfaction. Their fear was not of the labor, but of the invisibility. The thought that nobody would ever know the architecture of the thought that built the silver screen. Dream. They used the silence of the evening to polish the sequence, ensuring that the architecture of the script remained at foundation of the light. The scenario. Huts are now digital suites where screenplays are crafted, and the intertitle is a stylistic choice rather than a necessity. But the energy of the visual shorthand remains. The belief that an image is worth 1,000 words offers a sense of protective narrative clarity. You are not responsible for the writing of the titles or the pacing of the scenes. You are only a dweller within the enduring, quiet history of the written silence. The image of the glowing typewriter and the sketch of a gesture acts as your guide. The story is structured, the sequence is true, and the stage is hushed by the power of its own unspoken logic. You are secure in the steady, unhurried peace of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep stillness of the room section. 16. The silent screen child, the architecture of innocence, as the day begins to warm the glass enclosures. A smaller, more delicate force arrives on the lot, the silent screen child. In the 1920s, child stars like Jackie Coogan, Baby Peggy, and the Our Gang cast were the emotional center of the early studio. They were not just actors. They were architects of empathy, used by the studios to ground the melodrama in a universal language of innocence. This was the architecture of the vulnerable presence, the meticulous process of staging childhood for a global audience that viewed these children as symbols of hope in a post-war world. They harbored a secret worry that the industrial machinery of the studio would crush the spontaneity that made the child so valuable. They feared that the architecture of the studio was too rigid for the softness of the small performer. As you settle into the steady, unmoving calm of the evening, imagine the atmosphere of a nursery set or a schoolroom hut on the backlot. The sound is the high-pitched giggle of a child and the soft, encouraging murmur of a studio teacher or a stage mother. The air is sweet and warm, smelling of chalk dust, milk, freshly pressed linen, and the acrid ozone of the nearby arc lamps. The child actors harbored a secret worry about identity. diffusion, the fear that they were losing their own childhood to the character they played. They envisioned a future where work was separate from play, but in the present, their entire life was a performance. They used pretend games to insulate themselves from the boring adult requirements of the set, turning the act of filming into a fragmented fantasy. The architecture of innocence was a study in spontaneous management. Unlike adult actors, children could not be ordered into complex emotional states with the same megaphone intensity. This was the anxiety of the authentic moment. The directors harbored a secret worry that the child would become a machine, repeating gestures without the soul that the close-up demanded. This led to the creation of the secret story. A director like Charlie Chaplin would play with the child for hours before a take, planting the seed of the emotion in the physical reality of a toy or a snack. They understood that innocence cannot be faked, a philosophy that turned the set into a managed playground. They used their routine of the long rehearsal to anchor the trust, finding a meditative peace in the unscripted blink. They envisioned a world where children were digital, but for now, they found truth in the small human presence. The hidden worries of the stage mothers and guardians focused on the peril of the exposure. In the boring but high-stakes world of the lot, they had to protect the child from the harsh realities of the industry, the blinding lights, the long hours, and the cynicism of the crew. They harbored a secret worry that the child would age too fast, becoming a miniature adult with a fame-hardened heart. This created a culture of protective seclusion. They used tutors and toys to buffer the set, turning the studio into a gilded cage of development. They envisioned a world where the child came first, but in the 1920s, the image of the child was a million-dollar product. To the guardian, the child was not a worker. They were a fragile light that had to be shielded from the wind. The architecture of innocence also involved the psychology of the adult audience. The early creators understood that the child provided a moral anchor for the often scandalous world of Hollywood. This was the anxiety of the purity. They harbored a secret worry that the sins of the studio would be ascribed to the children. To bridge this gap, they created the persona of the waif, the orphaned, wide-eyed survivor who represented the indomitable human spirit. They envisioned a world where cynicism was defeated by a smile, a belief that made the child star a sacred icon. They used the routine of the close-up to insulate the vulnerability, finding a quiet pride in the universal tear. They envisioned a world where childhood was a state of grace, a philosophy that turned the film into a hymn to the small. The role of the studio teacher was to decorate the architecture with normalcy. In the silence of the schoolroom hut, they taught arithmetic and geography between calls for the set, knowing that the child's mind was a shifting landscape. This was the anxiety of the developmental gap. They understood that education is the only true escape, a philosophy that turned boring homework into a form of resistance. Their fear was not of the test, but of the emptiness, the thought that when the fame vanished, there would be nothing left of the person. They used their routine of the lesson plan to guard the future, finding a quiet pride in the unshaken focus. They envisioned a world where fame was a footnote, but until then, they found joy in the simple book. The contrast between the profound burden of the financial expectation and the natural smallness of the performer was the ultimate paradox of the silent screen child. A 7-year-old was often the primary breadwinner for an entire family and the savior of a studio's balance sheet. This inversion of power was the source of their nocturnal fatigue. Their fear was not of the performance, but of the growing up, the moment when the face would change and the architecture of innocence would crumble into the mundane. They used the silence of the evening to shed the costume, ensuring that the child remained a person behind the persona. The child labor laws are now stringent and clear, and the stage mother has become a cultural trope, but the energy of the innocent discovery remains. The belief that the small among us hold the most power offers a sense of protective, emotional clarity. You are not responsible for the guarding of the spontaneity or the teaching of the lessons. You are only a dweller within the enduring, quiet history of the architecture of innocence. The image of the oversized cap and the wide, curious eyes acts as your guide. The game is played, the lesson is learned, and the stage is hushed by the beauty of its own smallness. You are secure in the steady, unhurried peace of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep stillness of the room. As the California sun beats down on the unpaved expanses of the studio backlot, we witness the construction of the architecture of the chase, the kinetic heartbeat of the silent era that transformed the silver screen dream into a symphony of pure motion. In the 1920s, the chase was not just a plot device. It was the ultimate realization of the cinema's power to manipulate time and space. This was the era of mechanical velocity, where the goal was to harness the raw speed of the Model T, the locomotive, and the galloping horse to create a visceral, breathless experience for an audience that was still adjusting to the pace of the modern world. This was the anxiety of the unchecked momentum, the constant, thrilling fear that the energy of the scene would outrun the capacity of the camera to capture it. They harbored a secret worry that if the movement stopped, the magic of the cinema would stagnate and die. As you settle into the steady, unmoving calm of the evening, imagine the atmosphere of a chase unit filming on a dusty perimeter road. The sound is the unfiltered roar of an open-engine Ford and the rhythmic, thundering drumbeat of 30 horses' hooves hitting the hard-packed earth. The air is choked with a golden grit, smelling of gasoline, burnt rubber, animal sweat, and the acrid ozone of the desert heat. The cinematographers harbored a secret worry about vibrational distortion, the fear that the bouncing of the camera truck would turn the epic pursuit into a blurry, unwatchable mess. They envisioned a future where stabilization was digital and perfect, but in the present they were anchors of the frame, literally bolting themselves to the chassis of moving vehicles to steal the speed. They used hand-cranked focus to track the distance, turning the act of filming into a physical duel with physics. The architecture of the chase was a study in rhythmic editing. Because there was no dialogue to slow the pace, the chase relied on the geometry of the cut. This was the anxiety of synchronization. The editors harbored a secret worry that the visual pulse would miss a beat, breaking the illusion of the pursuit. This led to the creation of the acelerando, the technique of undercranking the camera, filming at 12 or 14 frames per second, so that when projected at the standard 24, the motion appeared supernatural and frantic. They understood that cinema is the art of the lie that tells the truth, a philosophy that turned mechanical distortion into emotional intensity. They used their routine of the splicing block, to compress the time, finding a meditative peace in the velocity of the image. They envisioned a world where speed was a button, but for now, they found strength in the hand-cranked blur. The hidden worries of the safety men focused on the peril of the unseen obstacle. In the boring but critical world of logistics, they had to clear the path for the chaos. They harbored a secret worry that a stray dog, a soft patch of sand, or a loose wheel nut would turn a comedy chase into a tragedy. This created a culture of kinetic vigilance. They used scout cars and choreographed signals to manage the risk, turning the unpredictable road into a managed stage. They envisioned a world where safety was guaranteed by the computer. But in the 1920s, they had to guard the line with whistles and flags. To the safety man, the chase was not a scene. It was a projectile that had to be guided to its target. The architecture of the chase also involved the psychology of the universal thrill. The early creators understood that speed is a language everyone speaks. This was the anxiety of the static audience. They harbored a secret worry that the people in the seats would become bored with the stillness of the drama. To bridge this gap, they developed the geography of the close call, the narrowly missed train, the dangling ledge, the shattering glass. They envisioned a world where tension was a constant, a belief that made the chase the sacred climax of the movie. They used the routine of the wide shot to insulate the scale, finding a quiet pride in the magnitude of the movement. They envisioned a world where excitement was a formula, but until then, they found joy in the raw rush. The role of the stunt driver was to decorate the architecture with bravery. In the silence of the cockpit, they pushed the primitive machines to their breaking point, knowing that the camera was their only witness. This was the anxiety of mechanical failure. They understood that man and machine must be one, a philosophy that turned driving into a form of dance. Their fear was not of the crash, but of the boring take, the thought that the speed would not translate to the flicker on the screen. They used their routine of the engine check to guard life, finding a quiet pride in the unshaken nerve. They envisioned a world where cars were invincible, but for now they found joy in the fragile metal. The contrast between the violent noise of the chute and the silent speed of the finished film was the ultimate paradox of the chase. The audience saw a silent, gliding pursuit, never hearing the screaming engines, and shouted curses that fueled it. This transmutation of energy was the source of their nocturnal satisfaction. Their fear was not of the effort, but of the forgetting, the moment when the audience would stop holding their breath. They used the silence of the evening to cool the radiators and rest the muscles, ensuring that the architecture of the chase remained a foundation of the kinetic dream. The primitive Fords are now CGI-enhanced supercars, and under is a digital filter, but the energy of the pure pursuit remains. The belief that life is movement offers a sense of protective kinetic clarity. You are not responsible for the clearing of the road or the cranking of the camera. You are only a dweller within the enduring, quiet history of the silent chase. The image of the spinning wheel and the vanishing horizon acts as your guide. The road is clear, the speed is true, and the stage is hushed by the power of its own momentum. You are secure in the steady, unhurried peace of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep stillness of the room. As the moon disappears behind a heavy California cloud, the studio lot transforms into the architecture of the shadow. the domain of the silent villain. In the 1920s, the antagonist was not just a character. They were a visual presence constructed out of darkness and angles. Because there were no snarling monologues or threatening whispers to rely on, the villain had to be projected through the architecture of the frame. This was the era of expressionistic menace, where a hunched shoulder, a lingering gaze, or a distorted silhouette functioned as a silent declaration of intent. They harbored a secret worry that if the shadow was not dark enough, the threat to the hero would appear boring or hollow. They feared that the light would reveal the human where a monster was. Required as you settle into the steady, unmoving calm of the evening, imagine the atmosphere of a villain's lair set deep within a darkened hut. The sound is the heavy, rhythmic breathing of the actor and the ominous, distant creak of a weighted door. The air is stagnant and cool, smelling of damp earth, cloying heavy cologne, stale tobacco, and the metallic ozone of the narrow, focused spotlights. The cinematographers harbored a secret worry about visual clarity, the fear that if they lost the villain in the dark, the audience would lose the story. They envisioned a future where shadows were adjustable pixels, but in the present, they were sculptors of the void, using black velvet and negative space carve the threat. They used low-angle lighting to distort the features, turning the human face into a map of malice. The architecture of the shadow was a study in psychological archetypes. For actors like Lon Chaney or Max Schreck, the villain was a physical transformation. They harbored a secret worry about persona leakage, the fear that their own kindness would peek through the makeup, ruining the spell of the menace. This led to the creation of the exaggerated presence. They understood that evil is a silhouette, a philosophy that turned body language into a weapon. They used unnatural stillness and spider-like movements to disturb the frame, finding a meditative intensity in the unblinking stare. They envisioned a world where villains were complex and relatable, but in the silent era, they were monolithic forces of nature, built out of charcoal and light. They used their routine of the makeup chair to insulate the soul, finding a strange safety in the grotesque mask. The hidden worries of the lighting. Technicians focused on the peril of the spill in the boring but high-stakes work of the stage. They had to control the leak of the light. They harbored a secret worry that a stray reflection would illuminate the villain's vulnerability, turning a god of terror back into a man in a suit. This created a culture of darkness, vigilance. They used barn doors and black flags to choke the beam, turning the set into a labyrinth of the unseen. They envisioned a world where light was perfectly contained, but in the 1920s, they had to fight the photons to keep the secret. To the gaffer, the shadow was not an absence. It was a solid material that had to be placed with a needle's precision. The architecture of the shadow also involved the psychology of universal fear. The early creators understood that what we don't see is more terrifying than what we do. This was the anxiety of the reveal. They harbored a secret worry that the monster in the light would look small and disappointing. To bridge this gap, they developed the language of the hidden presence, the shadow on the wall, the hand at the door, the reflection in the mirror. They envisioned a world where terror was a psychological state a belief that made the villain a projection of the audience's own darkness. They used the routine of the slow pan to insulate the dread, finding a quiet pride in the sustained tension. They envisioned a world where scares were jump cuts, but until then, they found joy in the lingering gloom. The role of the set decorator was to decorate the architecture with decay. In the silence of the proproom, they searched for twisted iron, torn tapestries, and jagged edges, knowing that the villain's environment had to echo their soul. This was the anxiety of the sterile space. They understood that evil lives in the ruins, a philosophy that turned old junk into a visual warning. Their fear was not of the clutter, but of the newness, the thought that a clean set would betray the character. They used their routine of the distressing aging, the props to guard the mood, finding a quiet pride in the authentic rot. They envisioned a world where everything was shiny and clean, but for now, they found joy in the dust. The contrast between the gentle reality of the actor and the terrifying architecture of the persona was the ultimate paradox of the silent villain. A man who loved children and flowers would spend his day stalking the innocent in a palace of shadows. This emotional dissonance was the source of their nocturnal fatigue. Their fear was not of the character, but of the stagnation. The moment when the villain would become a caricature rather than a force. They used the silence of the evening to wash away the gris paint, ensuring that the shadow remained on the screen and out of the heart. The expressionistic monsters are now nuanced anti-heroes and digital creatures, and the harsh shadows are soft-lit, cinematic moods. But the energy of the constructed menace remains. The belief that the dark holds the truth offers a sense of protective, psychological clarity. You are not responsible for the placing of the flags or the carving of the shadows. You are only a dweller within the enduring, quiet history of the silent villain. The image of the long, distorted shadow and the steady, unblinking gaze acts as your guide. The dark is deep, the threat is set, and the stage is hushed by the power of its own mystery. You are secure in the steady, unhurried peace of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep stillness of the room, as the day shifts into the long, golden shadows of the late afternoon. The studio lot settles into the architecture of the melodrama, the high-key emotional framework that served as the beating heart of the silent film industry. In the 1920s, melodrama was not considered a lesser genre. It was the supreme language of the screen, a meticulously built structure designed to amplify human suffering, sacrifice, and redemption to a universal frequency. This was the anxiety of the emotional scale, the constant, driving need to ensure that the internal agony of a mother losing her child or a lover facing a firing squad was audible to the eye. They harbored a secret worry that if the visual volume was not high enough, the grandeur of the tragedy would be lost in the boring silence of the theater. They envisioned a world where feeling was a physical force, a belief that turned the glass stage into a furnace of the soul. As you settle into the steady, unmoving calm of the evening, imagine the atmosphere of a melodrama set during the filming of a climax. The sound is the soaring, weeping vibration of the onset violin and the low, intense chanting of the director's instructions through the megaphone. The air is stifling and thick, smelling of warmed lily of the valley perfume, overheated electrical cables, damp handkerchiefs, and the heavy metallic scent of the brilliant white spotlights used to exalt the suffering. The actors harbored a secret worry about emotional depletion, the fear that they could not sustain the fever pitch of the characters' grief. For the 10 minutes it took to film a complex wide shot, they envisioned a future where subtlety was the law, but in the present, they were vessels of the extreme, turning the physical vibration of their own nerves into a visual signal. They used deep, rhythmic breathing to anchor the intensity, turning the act of weeping into a sculptural event. The architecture of the melodrama was a study in symbolic overload because there were no words to explain the depth of the betrayal. Every prop and every piece of the set had to echo the emotion. This was the anxiety of the literal object. They harbored a secret worry that a simple room would look too ordinary for a transcendent love. This led to the creation of the heightened environment. They used oversized furniture to make characters look small and victimized or jagged, leaning walls to mirror a disturbed mind. They understood that space is a feeling, a philosophy that turned the plywood set into a psychological map. They used their routine of the redress to intensify the mood, finding a meditative peace in the absolute clarity of the tragedy. They envisioned a world where realism was enough, but for now, they found strength. The hidden worries of the cinematographers focused on the peril of the flat frame. In the boring but vital world of lighting, they had to illuminate the soul. They harbored a secret worry that the tragedy would look gray rather than shimmering with light. This created a culture of luminescent vigilance. They used backlighting to create a halo of innocence around the heroine and sidelighting to reveal the cracks of doubt in the hero's face. They envisioned a world where cameras saw what the eye saw, but in the 1920s, they had to manufacture the spiritual glow with silver reflectors and gauze filters. To the cameraman, the melodrama was not a story. It was a canvas of photons that had to be stretched to the breaking point. The architecture of the melodrama also involved the psychology of the universal tear. The early creators understood that suffering is the great equalizer. This was the anxiety of the alienated audience. They harbored a secret worry that the high society setting or the period costumes would distance the viewer. To bridge this gap, they developed the language of the primal pose, the hand to the brow, the collapsed knees, the unblinking stare at the heaven. They envisioned a world where empathy was a science, a belief that made the melodrama a secular church. They used the routine of the long close-up to insulate the connection, finding a quiet pride in the collective sob of the theater. They envisioned a world where irony was the dominant tone, but until then, they found joy in the raw, unshielded heart. The role of the property master was to decorate the architecture with omens. In the silence of the workshop, they chose wilting roses, broken mirrors, and storm-tossed windows, knowing that the environment had to weep with the actor. This was the anxiety of the inexpressive prop. They understood that an object is a word, a philosophy that turned a letter into a death sentence. Their fear was not of the clutter, but of the randomness. The thought that an emotionally neutral item would dilute the frame. They used their routine of the meticulous arrangement to guard the grief. finding a quiet pride in the poetic resonance. They envisioned a world where stuff was just stuff, but for now, they found joy in the heavy meaning. The contrast between the hyper-caffeinated energy of the production and the profound stillness of the screen was the ultimate paradox of the melodrama. The audience saw a woman frozen in an eternal moment of loss, never knowing the director was shouting instructions just 2 feet away. This separation of the labor and the result was the source of their nocturnal fatigue. Their fear was not of the emotion, but of the emptiness. The moment when the magic would stop working and the audience would see only actors in makeup. They used the silence of the evening to wash away the salt of the tears, ensuring that the architecture of the melodrama remained a foundation for the sublime. The tearing of the hair has been replaced by quiet internal monologues, and the violin on set is now a temp track in an editor's headphones. But the energy of the high emotional dream remains. The belief that our feelings are monumental offers a sense of protective, emotional clarity. You are not responsible for the weeping of the actress or the lighting of the halo. You are only a dweller within the enduring, quiet history of the silent melodrama. The image of the glowing face and the outstretched hand acts as your guide. The grief is shared, the light is true, and the stage is hushed by the power of its own heart. You are secure in the steady, unhurried peace of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep stillness of the room. As the day turns toward the playful light of the morning, we enter the architecture of the silent comedy, the most mathematically precise and physically demanding structure in all of Hollywood. In the 1920s, slapstick was not a clumsy accident. It was a masterpiece of engineering where a trip, a fall, or a pie in the face was calculated with the rigor of a physics experiment. This was the architecture of the calculated chaos, the meticulous process of building the laugh out of timing, gravity, and the unyielding geometry of the set. They harbored a secret worry that if the rhythm was off by a single frame, the comedy would turn into boring, pointless movement. They envisioned a world where laughter was a reaction to a machine, a belief that turned the backlot into a mathematical playground. As you settle into the steady, unmoving calm of the evening, imagine the atmosphere of a comedy set on a busy Tuesday afternoon. The sound is not the weeping of the violin, but the rhythmic, sharp whistle of the director and the explosive staccato laughter of the crew. The air is dusty and bright, and the acrid ozone of the desert sun. The comedians harbored a secret worry about physical failure, the fear that a stiff joint or a slow reflex would ruin a one-take stunt. They envisioned a future where physics was digital, but in the present they were acrobats of the mundane, turning the frustrations of daily life into a visual ballet. They used intense physical rehearsal to anchor the timing, turning the act of falling into a moment of grace. The architecture of the silent comedy was a study in functional absurdity. For legends like Buster Keaton or Charlie Chaplin, the set was an opponent. This was the anxiety of the inanimate object. They harbored a secret worry that a door would refuse to open or a ladder would refuse to break at the exact moment the gag required. This led to the creation of the rigged environment. They used sugar glass windows, collapsible chairs, and counterweighted props to ensure that the chaos was controllable. They understood that comedy is a serious business, a philosophy that turned the plywood set into a mechanism for the absurd. They used their routine of the technical check to ensure the disaster, finding a meditative peace in the perfectly executed failure. They envisioned a world where nothing broke, but for now they found strength in the wreckage. The worries of the camera operators focused on the peril of the missed beat. In the boring but vital world of cranking, they had to manage the speed of the laugh. They harbored a secret worry that the frame rate would flatten the movement. This created a culture of kinetic vigilance. They used undercranking to sharpen the impact and overcranking to expand the surprise. They envisioned a world where time was a digital slider, but in the 1920s they had to feel the rhythm in their wrist. To the cameraman, the comedy was not a joke. It was a sequence of velocities that had to be captured with a surgeon's focus. The architecture of the silent comedy also involved the psychology of the universal underdog. The early creators understood that the world is out to get us. This was the anxiety of the powerless individual. They harbored a secret worry that the audience would not identify with the clown. To bridge this gap, they developed the language of the resilience. The shrug, the tip of the hat, the dusting off the pants. They envisioned a world where human dignity was indestructible, a belief that made the slapstick a triumph of the spirit. They used the routine of the wide shot to insulate the vulnerability, finding a quiet pride in the collective roar of the theater. They envisioned a world where humor was intellectual, but until then, they found joy in the raw physical truth. The role of the prop maker was to decorate the architecture with surprise. In the silence of the workshop, they built oversized shoes, trick canes, and exploding cigars, knowing that the gag had to visualize the impossible. This was the anxiety of the predictable prop. They understood that the familiar must become strange, a philosophy that turned a pancake into a weapon. Their fear was not of the clutter, but of the logic, the thought that a gag would be explained rather than seen. They used their routine of the mechanical testing to guard the wonder, finding a quiet pride in the unexpected result. They envisioned a world where objects were obedient, but for now they found joy in the rebellion. The contrast between the grim discipline of the preparation and the effortless joy of the screen was the ultimate paradox of the silent comedy. The audience saw a man accidentally falling through a roof, never knowing the weeks of engineering and physical bruises that made it possible. This transmutation of labor was the source of their nocturnal satisfaction. Their fear was not of the pain, but of the stagnation, the moment when the gag would become a routine rather than a discovery. They used the silence of the evening to reset the traps, ensuring that the architecture of the slapstick remained a foundation of the laugh. The pies are now CGI particles, and the physical dares are stunt-coordinated simulations, but the energy of the perfect timing remains. The belief that laughter is the ultimate resistance offers a sense of protective, comedic clarity. You are not responsible for the timing of the fall or the rigging of the door. You are only a dweller within the enduring, quiet history of the silent slapstick. The image of the spinning hat and the perfectly timed trip acts as your guide. The gag is set, the timing is true, and the stage is hushed by the power of its own absurdity. You are secure in the steady, unhurried peace of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep stillness of the room. As the late 1920s settle over the Hollywood hills, A new and terrifying vibration begins to shake the foundations of the glass cathedrals. The architecture of the transition. This was the arrival of synchronized sound, the talkies, and it did not arrive as a gentle upgrade, but as a technological earthquake that leveled the universal language of the silent era in an instant. The visual alchemy that had been perfected over 3 decades was threatened by the tyranny of the microphone. This was the anxiety of the vocal barrier, the realization that the iconic silhouettes who had commanded the world with a single glance now had to speak, and in doing so, they risked becoming ordinary. They harbored a secret worry that the ghostly grace of the silent screen would be crushed by the weight of the word, turning the dream factory into a boring recording studio. As you settle into the weightless, calm expanse of the evening, imagine the atmosphere of a transition set in 1928. The sound is no longer the rhythmic click of the camera or the soaring violin, but a deafening, oppressive silence. To record sound, every hum, creak, and whisper had to be eliminated. The air is stagnant and suffocating, as the glass stages were hastily enclosed with thick, heavy blankets and asbestos padding to dampen the California wind. The actors harbored a secret worry about vocal inadequacy, fearing that their nasal tones or regional accents would shatter the architecture of their established personas. They envisioned a future where sound was natural, but in the present, they were prisoners of the mic, forced to stand perfectly still near hidden microphones buried in vases of fake flowers. They used intense vocal coaching to anchor their new identity, finding a strange, fearful focus in the unfamiliar noise of their own voices. The architecture of the transition was a study in spatial constraint, because the early cameras were noisy. Clicking machines, they had to be locked away in soundproof booths known as iceboxes. These massive, lead-lined crates made the camera immobile, effectively killing the kinetic dream of the silent era. This was the anxiety of the static frame. The directors harbored a secret worry that the cinema was turning back into theater, losing its visual soul to the demands of the technician. They understood that movement is the lifeblood of film, a philosophy that turned the sound booth into a sarcophagus of the image. They used their routine of the vocal test to navigate the transition, finding a meditative patience in the slow, clunky process. They envisioned a world where microphones were invisible and mobile, but for now, the camera was a caged beast. The worries of the sound engineers focused on the peril of the unwanted noise in the boring but high world of the early Vitaphone or Movietone systems. They were the new masters of the set. They harbored a secret worry about mechanical intrusion, fearing that the click of a shoe or the rustle of a silk dress would ruin a master take. This created a culture of sonic vigilance. They used carpeted floors and greased hinges to purify the environment, turning the set into a silent laboratory. They envisioned a world where noise could be edited out, but in the late 1920s, they had to capture the perfect silence alongside the perfect speech. To the engineer, the sound was not an asset. It was a volatile substance that could explode the budget with a single stray cough. The architecture of the transition also involved the psychology of the fallen icon. As the talkies took hold, many of the silent vanguard found their careers dissolving in the new medium. This was the anxiety of the obsolescence. They harbored a secret worry that the audience's imagination, which had supplied the voices of the stars for years, would be disappointed by the reality. To bridge this gap, the studios launched massive publicity campaigns to introduce the voices of the gods. They envisioned a world where everyone could speak, but they lived in a world where silence was a dying luxury. They used the routine of the script to insulate the fear, finding a quiet pride in the evolution of the craft. They envisioned a world where sound enhanced the dream, a belief that made the pain of the change a necessary sacrifice. The role of the musician transformed overnight. The on-set violinist was replaced by post-production scoring, and the theater organist saw their dream palaces converted for synchronized speakers. This was the anxiety of the displaced melody. They understood that the human element was being mechanized, a philosophy that turned the lived performance into a recorded artifact. Their fear was not of the technology, but of the loss of the soul. The thought that the music would stop being a conversation with the audience. They used their routine of the studio recording session to guard the emotion, finding a quiet pride in the new scale of the sound. They envisioned a world where every movie had a symphony, but until then, they found joy in the new fidelity. The contrast between the visual freedom of the silent era and the sonic rigidity of the early talkies was the ultimate paradox of the transition. The silver screen had finally found its voice, but in doing so, it had lost its movement. This temporary paralysis was the source of their nocturnal fatigue. Their fear was not of the future, but of the stagnation. The moment when the camera would stop telling the story. They used the silence of the evening to study their lines, ensuring that the architecture of the transition remained a bridge to a new world rather than a wall. The icebox have been replaced by silent digital sensors, and the microphones are now microscopic and wireless. But the energy of the vocal discovery remains. The belief that our voices carry our truth offers a sense of protective, sonic clarity. You are not responsible for the dampening of the noise or the guarding of the mic. You are only a dweller within the enduring, quiet history of the sound transition. The image of the hidden microphone and the focused, speaking face acts as your guide. The voice is clear, the silence is pure, and the stage is hushed by the weight of its own new language. You are secure in the steady, unhurried peace of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep stillness of the room. As we reach the final architecture of the silent era, we enter the quiet glow of silver screen dreams, the enduring, eternal afterglow that persists long after the glass stages have been dismantled and the nitrate film has turned to dust. In the 2020s, the silent era is no longer a primitive ancestor of modern film. It is a sacred reservoir of visual purity that continues to inform every pixel and frame of our digital world. This is the architecture of the legacy, the realization that the flickering shadows of the 1920s established the deep grammar of the human soul on screen. This was the anxiety of the forgotten image, the fear that the silence would eventually be drowned out by the noise of the future. But they harbored a secret hope that the truth of the gaze would remain unbreakable. Asterisk, as you settle into the steady, unmoving calm of the evening. Imagine the atmosphere of a modern film archive at the stroke of midnight. The sound is the low electronic hum of climate-controlled servers and the soft, ghostly whir of a restoration scanner bringing a 1922 masterpiece back to life. The air is sterile and cool, smelling of clean electricity, anti-static brushes, and the faint, nostalgic scent of preserved history. The archivists harbored a secret worry about digital decay, the fear that the new records would be more fragile than the old nitrate. They envisioned a future where culture was permanent, but in the present. They were time travelers of the lens, turning the grain of the past into the clarity of the now. They used AI-enhanced algorithms to heal the scratches of a century, finding a meditative peace in the re-emergence of the light. The eternal afterglow is a study in archetypal persistence. When we look at a modern close-up or a chase scene, we are seeing the architecture of the Eju Arling's reimagined. This was the anxiety of the originality. They harbored a secret worry that everything had already been seen, but they understood that the human face is an infinite landscape, a philosophy that turned the silent performance into a timeless template. They used visual metaphors that still resonate across cultures, finding a meditative peace in the universality of the dream. They envisioned a world where art was a constant cycle, a belief that made their early struggles a foundational gift to the future. They used the routine of the creation to insulate the history, finding a quiet pride in the longevity of the shadow. The hidden worries of the modern viewer focus on the peril of the distraction. In a world of constant noise and fragmented attention, we harbor a secret worry that we have lost the ability to sit in the silence. But when the lights go down and a silent masterpiece begins to flicker, the architecture of the dream palace returns. We find ourselves leaning viewers, active participants in the construction of the story. We envisioned a world where entertainment was passive, but in the presence of the silent screen, we are co-creators of the emotion to the viewer. The silent film is not a boring relic. It is a sacred invitation to hear with the eyes. The quiet glow also involves the psychology of the silver grain. There is a texture to the past that digital clarity can never quite replicate, a vibrancy of the emulsion that feels organic and alive. This was the anxiety of the artificial. They harbored a secret worry that the machine would replace the soul, but the imperfections of the silent era, the flicker, the scratch, the soft focus, have become symbols of authenticity in a too-perfect world. They envisioned a world where everything was flawlessly rendered, but they lived in a world where beauty was born from the struggle. They used the routine of the manual craft to anchor the spirit, finding a quiet pride in the human touch of the film strip. The role of the historian is to decorate the architecture with context. In the silence of the library, they connect the threads of the past to the fabric of the present, knowing that we cannot know where we are going if we forget where we began. This was the anxiety of the void. They understood that history is a living conversation, a philosophy that turned boring dates into human stories. Their fear was not of the time, but of the indifference, the thought that the pioneers would be forgotten. They used their routine of the research to guard the memory, finding a quiet pride in the resurrected name. They envisioned a world where the past was always present, and in the eternal afterglow they found joy in the light. The contrast between the industrial grittiness of 1925 and the polished reverence of 2026 is the ultimate paradox of the silent legacy. The silver screen dream was born in a sweaty, noisy workshop and has matured into a serene cultural monument. This transcendence of the material is the source of our nocturnal satisfaction. Their fear was not of the end, but of the meaninglessness, the moment when the dream would stop being shared. They used the silence of the evening to watch the shadows, ensuring that the eternal afterglow remained a light for the weary mind. The glass enclosures are gone, the megaphones are silent, and the carbon arcs have flickered out. But the architecture of the silent dream is built into the walls of our consciousness. The belief that we are the stories we tell in the dark offers a sense of protective, eternal clarity. You are not responsible for the preservation of the film or the honoring of the past. You are only a dweller within the enduring, quiet history of the silver screen. The image of the flickering projector beam and the radiant, silent face acts as your guide. The story is told, the legacy is secure, and the stage is hushed by the power of its own immortality. You are secure in the steady, unhurried peace of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep stillness of the room. As the literal sun sets and the silver screen becomes the only light in the room, we enter the architecture of the subconscious. The profound realization that silent cinema was the first medium to perfectly replicate dream logic. In the 1920s, filmmakers discovered that without the grounding, literal nature of speech, the film could operate on a symbolic frequency that bypassed the logical mind and spoke directly to the internal soul. This was the era of cinematic surrealism, where a dissolve, a double exposure, or a slow-motion sequence functioned as a visual bridge into the world of sleep and memory. This was the anxiety of the rational bound, the constant, thrilling attempt to break the laws of physics, to represent the unfolding of a thought. They harbored a secret worry that if the logic was too clear, the magic of the dream would be lost to the boring reality of the everyday. As you settle into the steady, unmoving calm of the evening, imagine the atmosphere of an experimental set designed to represent a character's hallucination. The sound is the unnatural, heavy thrum of a specialized high-speed camera and the soft, distant chime of glass prisms being rotated in front of the lens. The air is cool and hazy, smelling of dry ice, cloying heavy incense, and the metallic dry dust of the distorted mirrors. The cinematographers harbored a secret worry about perceptual rejection, the fear that the audience would find the visual distortion too disturbing or nonsensical. They envisioned a future where effects were seamless, but in the present, they were architects of the uncanny, using hand-painted lenses and multiple exposures to layer the reality. They used unnatural lighting to flatten the space, turning the act of seeing into an act of dreaming. The architecture of the subconscious was a study in fluid identity. In the silence, a character could transform into a shadow or drift through walls without the need for a vocal explanation. This was the anxiety of the solid form. They harbored a secret worry that the audience would demand a reason for the impossible imagery. This led to the creation of the visual metaphor as narrative. They used a spiderweb to represent entrapment or a shattering mirror to represent a broken psyche. They understood that the image is the thought, a philosophy that turned the plywood set into a theater of the mind. They used their routine of the experimental take to probe the limits of the frame, finding a meditative peace in the ambiguity of the dream. They envisioned a world where everything had a name, but for now they found strength in the unnamed feeling. The hidden worries of the special effects pioneers focused on the peril of the visible seam. In the boring but high-stakes world of matting and optical printing, they had to fuse two worlds into one. They harbored a secret worry that a shaking tripod or a slight mismatch in light would reveal the trick, turning a vision of heaven back into two pieces of film. This created a culture of optical vigilance. They used meticulous measurements and black velvet masks to hide the boundary, turning the mechanical process into a seamless hallucination. They envisioned a world where the eye could not be fooled. But in the 1920s, they had to guide the eye through the shadows of the trick. To the effects artist, the subconscious was not an idea. It was a physical problem of the emulsion. The architecture of the subconscious also involved the psychology of the universal night. The early creators understood that we all dream in the same language. This was the anxiety of the cultural gap. They harbored a secret worry that their dream logic was too personal or specific. To bridge this gap, they developed a library of collective shadows: the long hallway, the falling sensation, the unseen follower. They envisioned a world where cinema was a shared sleep, a belief that made the surrealist film a universal mirror. They used the routine of the dissolve to insulate the transition, finding a quiet pride in the unspoken understanding of the audience. They envisioned a world where logic was the only king, but until then, they found joy in the rebellion of the image. The role of the set designer in the subconscious stage was to decorate the architecture with distorted truth. In the silence of the workshop, they built staircases to nowhere and doors that were too small, knowing that the environment had to feel like a memory. This was the anxiety of the proper proportions. They understood that perspective is a choice, a philosophy that turned straight lines into emotional curves. Their fear was not of the weirdness, but of the literalness, the thought that the audience would see a room rather than a state of being. They used their routine of the skewed construction to guard the mystery, finding a quiet pride in the authentic unreality. They envisioned a world where everything made sense, but for now, they found joy in the puzzle. The contrast between the mechanical rigidity of the camera and the infinite freedom of the imagination was the ultimate paradox of the subconscious architecture. A heavy iron machine was being used to capture the weightless flight of a dream. This transmutation of the material was the source of their nocturnal intensity. Their fear was not of the failure, but of the waking, the moment when the lights would come up and the subconscious would be pushed back into the box. They used the silence of the evening to re-examine the frames, ensuring that the architecture of the subconscious remained a foundation of the cinematic experience. The hand-painted mats are now digital environments, and the optical printing is software-driven, but the energy of the dream logic remains. The belief that there is a world behind the world offers a sense of protective psychological clarity. You are not responsible for the dissolving of the images or the layering of the exposures. You are only a dweller within the enduring, quiet history of the subconscious screen. The image of the drifting shadow and the distorted mirror acts as your guide. The dream is deep, the logic is true, and the stage is hushed by the power of its own unreality. You are secure in the steady, unhurried peace of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep stillness of the room. Section 24. The Global Echo Silent Film Beyond Hollywood. As we look beyond the glass houses of California, we witness the global echo, the realization that the silent era was truly international architecture. In the 1920s, cinema was a world language being built simultaneously in Berlin, Moscow, Tokyo, and Paris. This was the architecture of the Universal Bridge, where a Russian montage or a German expressionist angle could be adopted and understood by a filmmaker in New York within a matter of months. This was the anxiety of the cultural border, the constant, exciting realization that the image had no passport. They harbored a secret worry that the rise of nationalism would eventually dismantle the bridge, turning the global echo into a collection of whispers. They envisioned a world where art was the only flag, a belief that turned the distribution of reels into an act of diplomacy. As you settle into the weightless.com expanse of the evening, imagine the atmosphere of a foreign film exchange in 1925. The sound is the clatter of metal film cans being stamped with international shipping labels, and the low, polyglot murmur of translators working on the intertitles for a dozen different languages. The air is sharp and cool, smelling of ocean salt, heavy transit crates, paraffin wax, and the faint, vinegary scent of traveling nitrate. The distributors harbored a secret worry about censorship barriers, the fear that a cultural nuance or a bold visual idea would be pruned away by a local official. They envisioned a future where content was instant and global. But in the present, they were navigators of the distance, turning the reels of film into ambassadors of the gaze. The global echo was a study in cross-pollination. When German directors like Murnau or Lang brought their shadow-heavy architecture to the world, they rewrote the grammar of the silver screen dream. This was the anxiety of the influence. The American creators harbored a secret worry that their action-heavy style was too boringly literal compared to the European depth. This led to a state of creative theft as homage. They used unnatural angles and theatrical lighting to infuse their stories with soul. They understood that there is only one cinema, a philosophy that turned competition into a collaboration of the eye. They used their routine of the foreign screening to expand the mind, finding a meditative peace in the diversity of the vision. They envisioned a world where everything looked the same, but for now, they found strength in the accent of the frame. The hidden worries of the intertitle translators focused on the peril of the lost nuance in the boring but vital work of rewriting the story. They had to fit a new culture into the existing silence. They harbored a secret worry that a joke or a poetic thought would fall into the gap between the word and the image. This created a culture of linguistic vigilance. They used universal themes and clear, evocative prose to preserve the heart of the original, turning the act of translation into a recreation of the spirit. They envisioned a world where everyone spoke the same tongue. But in the 1920s, they had to bridge the silence with paper and ink. To the translator, the global echo was not a business, it was a puzzle of the human heart. The architecture of the global echo also involved the psychology of the shared experience. For the first time in history, a person in a London palace and a person in a Shanghai theater were crying at the same close-up. This was the anxiety of the connection. They harbored a secret worry that the differences between people were deeper than the flicker. But they understood that the face has no borders, a philosophy that turned the silent actor into a citizen of the world. They used the routine of the international release to insulate the piece, finding a quiet pride in the collective heartbeat of the planet. They envisioned a world where technology divided us, but for now, they found joy in the unifying light. The role of the avant-garde artist in the global echo was to decorate the architecture with revolution. In the silence of the European cafes, they planned films without actors and stories told only in shadows, knowing that the medium was limitless. This was the anxiety of the tradition. They understood that cinema is the newest art, a philosophy that turned every reel into a manifesto. Their fear was not of the failure, but of the safety, the thought that the movie would become just another commodity. They used their routine of the experimental short to guard the soul of the lens, finding a quiet pride in the disruption of the norm. They envisioned a world where everything was a blockbuster, but for now, they found joy in the fringe. The contrast between the national identities of the creators and the global identity of the audience was the ultimate paradox of the silent era. The movie was made in a specific place, yet it belonged to everywhere. This transcendence of geography was the source of their nocturnal intensity. Their fear was not of the distance, but of the shuddering, the moment when the world would stop talking through the screen. They used the silence of the evening to pack the crates, ensuring that the global echo remained a foundation of the international mind. The shipping crates are now high-speed data streams and global streaming platforms, but the energy of the universal bridge remains. The belief that we are one audience offers a sense of protective global clarity. You are not responsible for the translation of the titles or the shipping of the reels. You are only a dweller within the enduring, quiet history of the global silent screen. The image of the traveling film can and the many-faced audience acts as your guide. The bridge is built, the echo is loud, and the stage is hushed by the power of its own reach. You are secure in the steady, unhurried peace of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep stillness of the room. As the vibrant, chaotic energy of the early production era recedes into the distance, we enter the architecture of the archive, the somber and sacred process of preserving the ghost of the silent screen. In the decades following the arrival of sound, the vast majority of silent films were treated not as art, but as obsolete inventory. This was the anxiety of the material decay, the terrifying realization that nitrate film is not a permanent record, but a volatile, living substance that breathes, sweats, and eventually combusts. To enter a film vault in the mid-century was to encounter a slow-motion disaster, where the silver screen dreams were literally melting into a vinegary jelly. They harbored a secret worry that the entire history of the human gaze would be lost to the boring laws of chemistry. They envisioned a world where memory was a solid stone, but in the present, they were guardians of a vanishing mist, turning the act of storage into a mission of resurrection. As you settle into the steady, unmoving calm of the evening, imagine the atmosphere of a nitrate vault deep beneath the earth. The sound is the low, steady thrum of industrial refrigeration and the ghostly, metallic click of a winding machine as an archivist gently inspects a 100-year-old reel. The air is sterile and cold, smelling of sharp acetic acid, cold iron, wax, and the faint, haunting scent of camphor. The archivists harbored a secret worry about spontaneous combustion, the fear that the energy of the past would literally ignite the present if the temperature rose by even a few degrees. They envisioned a future where preservation was a digital perfection, but in the present they were surgeons of the cell, using white gloves and chemical baths to stabilize the decay. They used meticulous frame-by-frame repair to anchor the image, turning the boring labor of the lab into a ritual of devotion. The architecture of the archive was a study in ethical reconstruction. When a lost film is found, perhaps in a forgotten basement in Buenos Aires or a mislabeled box in Amsterdam, it rarely arrives intact. This was the anxiety of the fragment. They harbored a secret worry that the restored version would never truly capture the original spirit of the creator. This led to the creation of the restoration code. They used original production notes and hand-colored frames to guide the repair, turning the broken artifact back into a fluid dream. They understood that to save a film is to save a soul, a philosophy that turned the plywood sets of the past into monuments of the mind. They used their routine of the microscan to insulate the history, finding a meditative peace in the slow return of the light. They envisioned a world where nothing was ever lost, but for now, they found strength in the rescue. The architecture of the archive was a study in ethical reconstruction. When a lost film is found, perhaps in a forgotten basement or a mislabeled box, it rarely arrives intact. This was the anxiety of the fragment. They worried the restored version would never truly capture the original spirit of the creator. This led to the creation of the restoration code. They used original production notes and hand-colored frames to guide the repair, turning the broken artifact back into a fluid dream. They understood that to save a film is to save a soul, a philosophy that turned the plywood sets of the past into monuments of the mind. They used the microscan to insulate the history, finding a meditative peace in the slow return of the light. They envisioned a world where nothing was ever lost, finding strength in the rescue. The hidden worries of the database managers focused on the peril of the digital gap. In the vital world of migration, they had to move the ghosts from nitrate to acetate, and then from analog to digital. They worried that essential information, the texture of the grain, or the rhythm of the flicker, would be lost in the translation. This created a culture of high-fidelity vigilance. They used ultra-high-definition scanners and lossless formats to house the ghost. They envisioned a world where access was universal, but had to guard the gate between the past and the future. To the archivist, the archive was not a morgue. It was a living library where the dead were allowed to speak with their eyes. The architecture of the archive also involved the psychology of the cultural inheritance. The early creators understood they were building the first chapter of a new world. This was the anxiety of the legacy. They worried that the future would find their silent stories to be childish or irrelevant. To bridge this gap, the archive became a place of rediscovery, where scholars and fans could study the blueprint of modernity. They envisioned a world where art was a conversation across time, a belief that made the heavy metal film cans into time capsules of human feeling. They used the routine of the screening to insulate the connection, finding a quiet pride in the renewed gasp of the audience. They envisioned a world where history was a burden, but until then, they found joy in the inheritance. The role of the philanthropist and the film foundation was to decorate the architecture with resources. In the silence of the boardroom, they allocated millions of dollars to save a single movie, knowing that some things are beyond price. This was the anxiety of the market value. They understood that culture is the only thing we leave behind, a philosophy that turned old footage into a sacred asset. Their fear was not of the cost, but of the indifference. The thought that a masterpiece would turn to dust because nobody cared. They used their routine of fundraising to guard the legacy, finding a quiet pride in the unshaken commitment. They envisioned a world where everything was profitable, but found joy in the priceless. The contrast between the violent fragility of the nitrate and the sterile permanence of the digital vault was the ultimate paradox. The dream was born in a flammable substance and is now stored in a cold, electric cloud. This transmutation of the vessel was the source of their nocturnal intensity. Their fear was not of the change, but of the erasure, the moment when the file would be deleted, or the vault would be forgotten. They used the silence of the evening to check the backups, ensuring that the architecture of the archive remained a foundation of the memory. The nitrate fires are now a fading memory, and the white gloves have been supplemented by coding scripts, but the energy of the preserved ghost remains. The belief that what we save saves us offers a sense of protective historical clarity. You are not responsible for the stabilizing of the chemicals or the scanning of the frames. You are only a dweller within the enduring, quiet history of the film archive. The image of the unspooling silver and the radiant, rescued face acts as your guide. The frame is fixed, the light is back, and the stage is hushed by the power of its own survival. You are secure in the steady, unhurried peace of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep stillness of the room. As we reach the final architecture of the silent era, we arrive at the silent screen legacy. The 1920s were not a prelude to modern life, but the actual blueprint for it. Every visual rhythm, psychological hook, and social construction we navigate today was drafted in the silence of early studios. This was the architecture of the modern mind, where the image became the dominant currency of human experience. We live in a world built by the silent icons, a landscape where visibility is power and the gaze is the ultimate judge. They harbored a secret worry that the world they were building would become too intense for the human heart to carry. But they also harbored a profound pride in the beauty of the dream. They envisioned a future where the screen was everywhere, and in the silent screen legacy, they saw the universal language finally realized. As you settle into the calm expanse of the evening, imagine a modern city square where giant digital screens pulse with silent messages. The sound is the distant, muffled roar of the 21st century, but the logic of the light is pure 1925. The air is charged with information, smelling of ozone, warm plastic, coffee, and the faint electric scent of a world that never sleeps. The creators of the past harbored a secret worry about visual overload, the fear that if everything was a movie, nothing would be real. They envisioned a future where the dream and the life were one. And in the silent screen legacy, they found the architecture of the shared soul. They used light and shadow to map the human experience, turning the boring details of existence into a cinematic event. The silent screen legacy is a study in archetypal continuity. When we swipe through a gallery of faces or watch a silent clip on a handheld device, we are participating in a 100-year-old ritual. This was the anxiety of the modern pace. They harbored a secret worry that the speed of the world would outrun the capacity for empathy. But they understood that the human connection is timeless, a philosophy that turned the silent performance into a blueprint for the digital age. They used emotional archetypes that transcend the technology, finding a meditative peace in the persistence of the gaze. They envisioned a world where the screen was a wall, but they built a world where the screen was a bridge. They used the routine of the image to insulate the isolation, finding a quiet pride in the shared vision. The hidden worries of the future architects focus on the peril of the disconnection. In the boring but high-stakes world of content creation, they have to reinvent the wonder every day. They harbor a secret worry that the audience has seen it all before. But when they look back at the silent era, they find the raw power that still drives the heart. This created a culture of creative ancestry. They use the pioneer's toolkit, the close-up, the chase, the shadow, to rebuild the dream for a new generation. They envision a world where the story never ends, and in the silent screen legacy, they find the sacred grammar that keeps it alive. To the modern creator, the silent film is not a relic. It is a source code for the universal heart. The architecture of the silent screen legacy also involved the psychology of the permanent image. We live in an era where everything is recorded, a reality that the early studio moguls could only dream of. This was the anxiety of total visibility. They harbored a secret worry that the secret self would vanish under the lights. But they also understood that to be seen is to exist, a philosophy that turned the star into a prototype for the modern individual. They used the routine of the camera to validate the existence, finding a quiet pride in the immortality of the flicker. They envisioned a world where fame was a universal right, and in the silent screen legacy, they built the infrastructure for the modern ego. The role of the dreamer in the silent legacy is to decorate the architecture with hope in the silence of the night. We look at the flickering screen and find ourselves reflected in the shadows, knowing that we are part of a long, beautiful line. This was the anxiety of the solitude. They understood that cinema is the art of not being alone, a philosophy that turned boring reality into a communal journey. Their fear was not of the dark, but of the silence, the thought that nobody was listening. But in the silent screen legacy, they found the language that needs no ears. They used their routine of the imagination to guard the human spirit, finding a quiet pride in the unshaken dream. The contrast between the wooden scaffolding of 1920 and the infinite pixels of 2026 is the ultimate paradox of the silent legacy. The silver screen dream was built by hand-cranked cameras and plywood sets, yet it has survived the transition to the digital infinite. This resilience of the vision is the source of our nocturnal satisfaction. Their fear was not of the future, but of the boring, the moment when the wonder would cease. They used the silence of the evening to watch the stars, ensuring that the architecture of the silent screen legacy remained a light for the human journey. The studios have become global conglomerates, and the silent icons are immortal archetypes. But the energy of the first dream remains. The belief that we can capture the soul in light offers a sense of protective, eternal clarity. You are not responsible for the maintenance of the legacy or the guarding of the blueprint. You are only a dweller within the enduring, quiet history of the silver screen. The image of the unbroken beam of light and the radiant, silent world acts as your guide. The story is told, the blueprint is true, and the stage is hushed by the power of its own immortality. You are secure in the steady, unhurried peace of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep stillness of the room.